This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jenn Broda. But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Chapter 1. I am going to begin a diary again, because I have got quite a little time on my hands, with nothing to do for quite a time. I mean, in the first place, I am full of ambitions, and I think that practically every married girl ought to have a career if she is wealthy enough to have the home life carried on by the servants, especially if a girl is married to a husband like Henry, because Henry is quite a homebody, and if a girl was a homebody too, she would encounter him quite often. So that is why I try to do something in life and not let everything stop just because I have married the one of my choice. But I always believe in knowing several different kinds of people, and as long as my husband is of the wealthy classes, I prefer to meet brainy gentlemen who have got ideas on the outside. So I am practically always picking up something, and then when I go back and encounter Henry, I always have some new remark or other to make. For if Henry and I spent all of our time together, neither of our ideas would be so bright. And it is bright ideas that keep the home fires burning and prevent a divorce from taking all of the bloom off romance. So after Henry and I became married, the first career I started to have was the cinema, and we produced a super production based on the sex life in the period of Dolly Madison. But when they wrote the scenario, we had quite a little trouble, because the scenario writer wanted it to be full of nothing but psychology, and the director wanted it to be full of mob scenes and ornamental sets, and Henry wanted it to be full of a great moral lesson. And I did not care what it was full of, so long as it was full of plenty of cute scenes where the leading man would chase me around the trunk of a tree, and I would peek out at him like Lillian Gish. So then Mr. Goldmark, the great film magnate, said, "Why not be on the safe side and have it full of everything?" So the scenario turned out to be delightful because it was not only a cute love story, but it was quite psychological, and it also taught a great moral lesson and had very ornamental sets in addition to a violent mutiny in the army. And it was really so full of everything that sometimes 3 or 4 things had to happen at once. For instance, the most psychological scene that Dolly Madison had took place in the mother-of-pearl bathtub of an executive mansion, thinking of her sweetheart in double exposure, with the mutiny of the army going on right outside the bathroom window. Well, it seems that Dolly Madison was a Washington girl, so we had to go to Washington, D.C. to take the scenes on account of historical accuracy. But it was quite difficult to make the motion pictures in Washington, because just when you select some delightful spot near the Capitol and get everything all ready to take the scene, Senator Borer or some other great man would come up and plant himself in front of the camera. I mean, it is practically impossible to have a camera at Washington, D.C. and keep great men away from the front of it. And after all, those senators would have practically ruined the picture because, even if their costumes are quite quaint, they are not in the period of Dolly Madison. So I finally asked Dorothy to think up some good excuse to make them go away, and Dorothy told them that they would have to get out because we were making a psychological picture and their mental state had not yet reached the period of Dolly Madison. But I really think Dorothy could have used her brains and thought up a little more tack to use on senators. Well, when our cinema was finished, the title turned out to be Stronger Than Sex, which was thought up by quite a bright girl in Mr. Goldmark's suite of offices. And the great moral lesson was that girls could always help it if they would only stop and think of Mother. And the close-up of me, where I stopped and thought of Mother, with a special lighting effect and blurred photography through a gauze screen, was really quite flattering. So we would have gone right on making more cinemas, except for something. Because I am very fond of kitties, and when a girl has married a wealthy gentleman like Henry, motherhood is even more beautiful, especially if it turns out to look like Daddy. And even Dorothy says that a kid that looks like any rich father is as good as money in the bank. I mean, sometimes Dorothy becomes philosophical and says something that really makes a girl wonder how anyone who can make such a philosophical remark can waste her time like Dorothy does. And I always think that the sooner a girl becomes a mother after the ceremony, the more likely it is to look like Daddy. I mean, before a girl's mind gets concentrated on something else. But Dorothy said she would stop at one kitty if she was I, because she thinks that one is enough of almost anything that looks like Henry. But Dorothy has no reverence for motherhood. So of course I had to give up the cinema, because I could not be as dishonest as one married cinema star I knew who signed a contract to do quite a long serial and did not tell the film corporation her secret. So before the serial was half finished, it began to become quite embarrassing to take scenes of her in full length, because in the scenario, she was only supposed to be a slip of an unmarried girl. So finally, they had to start taking all of her scenes, showing nothing but her head sticking up over the top of a bush or looking out of a window, and the result was that she got more close-ups than any film star ever got before. But I don't think it is honorable to get close-ups by such a means as that. Well, after Henry heard about my secret, he had the idea to go and live at their old country estate where our little mouse could be born. Because Little Mouse was the nickname we thought up to call it by, until we found out what it was going to turn out to be. But I really preferred New York, so I told Henry that his whole family had been born in the suburbs of Philadelphia, so why not give our little mouse a chance? Because I read in a scientific medical book called Waiting for the Little Stranger that you should be where you can look at quite a lot of art and have sweet thoughts and read nothing but beautiful poems and beautiful novels before it takes place. But Dorothy said I better slip in a page of Ring Lardner once in a while, or if he was a boy, he might grow up to be a milliner. But anyway, I told Henry we ought to go to New York, where all the art and literature is. But Henry said their own parlor in the suburbs of Philadelphia was practically full of art, because his father had spent years and years collecting nothing else. And there really are quite a lot of small-size crockery statues of girls and their escorts getting ready to break into a minuet, with 3 glass showcases full of early period watches, to say nothing of the large marble statue of a full-size baby having a bath with a real sponge in his hand, and 7 piano lamps. So Henry said, why go to New York with all of that art under my own roof? But I told Henry that the art in our parlor was finished, but the art of New York is still going on, and you can meet great artists at their exhibitions and ask why they did it and learn something. But Henry thought he ought to stay where his father was, because Henry's father is over 90, and Henry was trying to break him of quite a bad habit he had of making a new will every time a new nurse went on the case. And it does not seem to matter how unattractive a new nurse they are able to find, Henry's father can always weave a romance around her, until we sometimes wish that he would get well, or something. And Henry's mother is just as full of romance as his father. I mean, when an elderly lady of 72 is always getting an idea that the butler is madly in love with her, it is quite difficult to keep in butlers. And Dorothy says that if we could only manage to get all the songwriters to meet Henry's mother, it would be the quickest way to free the world of mother songs. And as for Henry's sister, she and I have practically nothing that is common. I do not mind boyish models on girls if they copy some well-groomed fashion plate, like what the young man will wear, for instance. But Anne Spofford is the kind of a type that spends all of her time between a stable and a kennel without having pressing done. I always try to think the best of everyone, and I really suppose it is quite unselfish for a girl to spend weeks and weeks washing a dog with mange cure to cure its mange and never give a thought to herself. But after all, she could be kind to people too, and make more use of eau de cologne before coming into the salon. So I finally had to put my brains to work to get Henry to move to New York. And when I put them to work, I discovered that the real reason Henry wanted to stay in the suburbs of Philadelphia was because he is quite prominent as long as he stays there. But by the time he arrives in New York, he does not seem to be so unusual. Because after all, to be prominent at New York, people have to be like Mr. Otto Kahn, for instance, who does quite a lot for art. Or else like the reformers, who do quite a lot against it. Mr. Kahn can always make himself prominent by starting some artistic play, while any reformer can make himself prominent by stopping one. But Henry never seems to have enough ideas to start anything. And even if it does not take any ideas to stop something, New York is full of such a lot of that kind of people that the competition is quite heavy. And the only thing that Henry can really do is talk against low morals. And he does not even seem to be able to make people repent, because the only ones who ever want to listen to that kind of conversation are people whose morals are pure and who only want to listen to it talked about. And the risque things that Henry can think up may intrigue the suburbs of Philadelphia, but they really would not be such a thrill in New York. Well, of course, when gentlemen from Kansas City or St. Louis come to New York and feel themselves becoming unprominent, they can always make themselves very important by spending quite a lot of money on head waiters and ticket speculators and the hostesses at nightclubs. For practically anyone can call Texas Guinan by her first name for a few $100s, but being prominent at Texas Guinan's would not really amuse Henry, unless he could go there and notice people enjoying themselves, and then be prominent in getting it closed up. So I had to think quite hard to think up some way to make Henry feel prominent in New York, and I decided that the quickest way was for him to join some associations. So then I thought of a gentleman friend of mine in New York who is very, very prominent and belongs to practically everything, and I wrote him a letter and asked him if he could get some invitations for Henry to come to New York and belong to something or other. So this gentleman belongs to the Friends of Culture and the Nature Lovers Association and New York Distemper League, which is against dogs having distemper, and the Ohio Society. And he got Henry an invitation to join everything except the Ohio Society, because it seems that the Ohio Society is very exclusive because you have to be born in Ohio. But he got Henry an invitation to join the Pennsylvania Society, which is not so exclusive because all you have to be born at is Pennsylvania. Well, when Henry started to receive all of those invitations, it made him feel very good to think that his prominence had reached New York. So he decided to go right up there and join everything that asked him. So of course he had to take me too. And when I got back into the Ritz again, after all of the home life I had been through, I almost believe I heaved a sigh. Well, the very first evening that Henry was in New York, he went to a large banquet and sat at the same table as Amy Botsfield Rand, who is very intellectual because she went to China once and can hardly bear anything since she came back, and Percy Gilchrist Saunders, who is very famous for thinking that spelling ought to sound like what it resembles, and Chester Wentworth Peabody, who spends all of his time watching squirrels and writes down every move they make. And meeting all of those famous people that New York is practically full of gave Henry new thoughts and opened up things. Because after Henry held a conversation with them, he was quite surprised to find out that he was just as full of brains as they were. But that is what always happens to people who have an inferior complex about coming to New York. Because no matter how inferior your complex is, you can always meet very prominent people in New York who have not got any more brains than you have. And when Henry came home from the banquet, I slipped into his bedroom in my pink negligee, and I finally got him to promise that we would live in New York where our life could be more mental. And so I gave Henry a subscription to the Book of the Month Club that tells you the book you have to read every month to make your individuality stand out. And it really is remarkable because it makes over 50,000 people read the same book every month. So then we took an apartment in the newest apartment house on Park Avenue, and I got nothing but the oldest antiques to go in it, with everything in antique Italian and one of the oldest Rembrandts. I really almost have to smile, because I used to think that every interior ought to be decorated in pink satin with quite a lot of Maryborough. But after a girl has learned art, she can hardly stand anything except old Italian. So instead of chiffon negligees with ostrich feather trimmings, like I always used to wear, I wear nothing but antique Italian brocade with a long train made out of some middle-age embroidered Pope's robe with all the faded colorings. And when we did the nursery for Little Mouse, the interior decorator found a real genuine Italian cradle of one of the oldest centuries. But Dorothy said that the old Italian's idea when he made it was that if the baby cashed in, the cradle was just the right shape for the funeral. And Dorothy was afraid that any baby that had to sleep in it would grow up with acute melancholy. I mean, sometimes Dorothy does have quite a good idea, because it did turn out that an antique Italian apartment becomes quite depressing, especially on a rainy day. So I have Dorothy practically stay with us to keep from becoming too depressed in such an antique Italian environment. Well, the day finally came when the little mouse was due to arrive, and Dorothy and I were having luncheon at the Ritz. And after luncheon, Dorothy was going shopping, and then she was going to an informal tea. So she invited me to accompany her. Well, I am really fond of nothing as much as shopping and even informal teas, but I finally decided I had better not go, so I went home instead. And when they put Little Mouse in my arms that afternoon, I felt repaid for giving up everything. But when I called up Dorothy at the tea party to break the news that it turned out to be a boy, well, nothing touches people's hearts so much as a girl they are acquainted with going through the valley of the shadow and coming out with a baby. So everybody at the tea wanted to come right over. And I sat up in bed in my early Italian bed jacket, and we held quite a party to welcome the little mouse. I mean, people kept coming in, and I had to keep telephoning to Rubens to send over more sandwiches. But the nurse would only give us a small glimpse of the little mouse, because noise and cigarette smoke are not good for little babies the day of their arrival. But after all, I was repaid for going through all of those pangs, because Henry settled quite a large settlement on me. For nothing makes a husband become so sentimental in a financial way as the day he can call a girl Little Mother. Well, after it was all over, of course Henry wanted me to stay at home and be nothing else but a wife and mother, and I really did not mind, so long as I had to stay in bed anyway. But when I got out of bed, my brains started in to become active, and I began to think about a career. But I decided not to produce any more cinemas, because Stronger Than Sex went right over people's heads and became a financial failure. So, I decided to become literary instead and spend more time in some literary environment outside the home. Chapter 2 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, I soon found out that the most literary environment in New York is the Algonquin Hotel, where all the literary geniuses eat their luncheon. Because every genius who eats his luncheon at the Algonquin Hotel is always writing that that is the place where all the great literary geniuses eat their luncheon. So I invited Dorothy to accompany me and go there at luncheon time. But Dorothy said that if I wanted to meet highbrows, she was going to a literary party that was being held by George Jean Nathan at a place in Jersey that is noted for serving the kind of beer that is made without ether. And Mr. H.L. Menschken, Theodore Drescher, Sherwood Anderson, Sinclair Lewis, Joseph Hergesheimer, and Ernest Boyd would be there. So I said to Dorothy, if they are all so literary, why do they go to a place like New Jersey, which is chiefly noted for being inartistic? And the only reason that Dorothy could think up was on account of the beer. But I finally decided to go because some of them do write quite well-read novels. But if anybody thinks that what they held in New Jersey was a literary salon, they would really be mistaken, because they did not even mention their literary work. And nobody could have heard them if they had, because they kept putting nickels in an electric piano and breaking into risque songs. And I think that when literary people wish to hold a musical evening, it is more artistic to buy tickets to some good opera. But I should have known enough to have my doubts about the literature of any literary gentlemen who have friendships with an unmental girl like Dorothy. So the next day, I made Dorothy go to luncheon at the Algonquin Hotel, and that made up for everything. For they are the critics who tell everybody else how to do it, and they know how to act. I mean, after all, they spend practically all their time showing everybody else how literary people ought to act. Well, we went to luncheon at the Algonquin Hotel quite early, so that we could actually see them walk in, and I have learned that the best way to get a table near someone where you want to sit is to become friendly with the head waiter. Well, the famous head waiter at the Algonquin is called George, who holds a velvet rope across the doorway of a small exclusive dining room to keep people who do not appreciate genius from going where they do not belong. For they also have a more unexclusive dining room for the benefit of the masses. Well, I told George that we wished to sit near the famous literary round table, where we could overhear them say something or other. So George gave us the very nearest table of all, and the waiter who waited on us was the very one who waits on them himself. So the waiter and I broke into a conversation, and it came out that his name was not only Tony, but he was full of ideals, too. It really seems that the more I see of everybody, the more I realize that you never know who you are talking to. Because Tony told me that a man's body may only be a Greek waiter, but his soul may be full of all the culture of the ancient Greeks themselves. I mean, it seems that Tony was raised to be a gentleman because his father was quite a prominent Grecian who also had a son that was legitimate. So Tony's father put them both together and educated them by a tutor in all of the classics of the Grecian days. But Tony's father had become quite fed up with Tony's mother, and so he got a Turkish chum of his to arrange for her to be present at an atrocity. It seems that the Turkish enjoy nothing so much as an atrocity, and Tony thinks it is the result of prohibition. Because the Turkish have always had prohibition, and Tony says that when things begin to get on a Turk's nerves, he cannot go out and have a drink and forget it, but he finally reaches the point where he has to do something violent in a hurry. And Tony says that when he reads about the novel kind of murders we Americans can think up, and the enjoyable times we have at all of our murder trials, we Americans remind him quite a lot of the Turkish. So that is what made Tony think it is the result of prohibition. So I paid Tony a compliment for his brains in thinking things out, and Dorothy said she would pay him another one for some chicken hash in a hurry. So he had to stop his conversation and go get it, because at luncheon time, Dorothy's mind practically always runs on the subject of food, while I never seem to notice whether I'm eating or not, so long as I am learning something. Well, when Tony came back, I asked him to tell me all about the geniuses of the Round Table, and it turned out that he knows them quite well, for they are all very fond of him. I mean, most waiters are more interested in tips than they are in listening to geniuses converse, and the waiter that they had before Tony was quite a low Greek, from Sardanapalus, who had practically no interest in culture. But Tony is different, and he listens with all his ears, and he hears even more than the geniuses do themselves, because they are so busy thinking up some cute remark to make next that they never have time to do any listening. Well, the first genius who came in was Joel Crabtree, the great writer who writes a long column every day on the subject of everything. I mean, providing it happened to some friend of his, because it makes Mr. Crabtree feel very, very good to have everybody think that his friends are greater geniuses than anybody else's friends. So the day never goes by that every one of his friends are not mentioned in his literary column, and all of the public that is interested in literature enough to read it can find out what they have been doing every hour of the day or night. So naturally, they are always trying to do something readable on purpose, like a match game of amusing tiddlywinks, or charades at one another's parties, or some laughable croquet championship in Central Park, where you can draw quite a crowd with almost anything. So then, the famous critic of the drama came in, called Harry Appleby, and his job is to discover girls who remind him of Doucet. And it really is quite difficult, because if you discover a girl, she naturally has to be quite young, and when a girl is so young, she never seems to have as much technique as Doucet had. But Mr. Appleby always overlooks that point if she is cute enough in other ways, because there is nothing that this great critic of drama loves so much as an actress, or even an actor, being cute. And if a play is cute in addition, he feels that the height of drama has occurred at last. So Tony loves to listen to Mr. Appleby, and then he writes to his cousin at Athens that he has practically been listening to Sophocles. I mean, he has to mention names that his cousin can understand, because Tony says his cousin is an ignorant fellow, and he would no more know that Mr. Appleby was a famous genius at the Algonquin than Mr. Appleby would know that Sophocles was a famous genius at Greece. And the next literary genius who came in was Peter Hood, the writer, who is always falling in love with some new girl. And when a genius falls in love with a lady genius, Tony says, there is hell to pay, because he cannot go off and have an affair and keep his mouth shut like a waiter, but he has to talk it all over with his wife, and then they have to look it up in the psychoanalysis, and then they have to talk it all over with all the other geniuses, and they really never get any conclusion on the subject. Well, finally, all of the geniuses were present at last, and the way the conversation worked out was really remarkable. Because first, one genius said to another, "What was that screamingly funny remark you made last Tuesday?" So then he told it, and they all laughed. And then it was his turn to ask, "And what was that terribly clever thing you said on Friday?" So then the other genius got his chance, and it was all give and take so that everybody had an opportunity to talk about himself. But then Mr. Ernest Boyd came in and sat right down at their table, and I am sure that he was not welcome, because he was the one at Mr. Nathan's party in New Jersey who rendered the most unrefined song of the whole evening. So how could he appreciate the kind of conversation they hold at the Algonquin? But he really seemed to laugh louder than anyone. I mean, he even laughed when nobody else did, and they finally had to cast dark looks in his direction. So then they all started to tell about a famous trip they took to Europe. And they had a marvelous time, because everywhere they went, they would sit in the hotel and play cute games and tell reminiscences about the Algonquin. I think it is wonderful to have so many internal resources that you never have to bother to go outside of yourself to see anything. So then, Mr. Boyd spoke up and asked what fellow literateurs did you meet on your trip abroad. I mean, Mr. Boyd does not know the etiquette of holding a conversation, and he kept asking questions that had very little reply. But it turned out that one of them did have a letter to a literateur called James Joyce, but he did not bother to present it because he said, after all, James Joyce did not know who he was, and why bother to meet somebody who knew so little about the Algonquin that he probably would think it meant a tribe of uncivilized Indians. But Mr. Boyd went right on and said, "Why didn't you take a sporting chance and meet him? He might have had something to say." And then they told Mr. Boyd that every time they met somebody new, they had to stop and explain all of their personal allusions before their jokes could be laughed at, and it only wasted everybody's time. And I really do not know why the geniuses at the Algonquin should bother to learn about Europe any more than Europe bothers to learn about them. So they came back because they like the Algonquin best after all, and I think it is remarkable because the old proverb tells about the prophet who was without honor in his own home. But with them, it is just the reverse. Well, Dorothy finally finished her chicken hash and spoke up and said that she had overheard enough intellectual conversation for one day, so she was going out to hunt up a friend of hers who only talks about himself when he has a toothache. And I was really glad she went, because then something happened that was really embarrassing, but it ended up becoming one of the greatest thrills of my life. I mean, Mr. Boyd looked over and noticed me, so of course I had to throw him a smile. And then he turned and addressed the whole round table and said, "Gentlemen, you are always discovering a Doucet or a Sappho or a Cleopatra every week, and I think it is my turn, because I have discovered a young lady who is all three rolled into one. May I have the permission to bring Mrs. Henry Spofford over to the table?" Well, they really pay very little attention to anything Mr. Boyd says, but they said they did not mind. So he escorted me over to their table and introduced me, and almost all of them nodded to me, and some of them even spoke. And they let me sit there until luncheon was all over. Well, Mr. Hood noted my reverence for everything they said, and he finally told me that he realized I had more in me than I looked. So he issued me an invitation to come to luncheon every day. And I really would not be surprised, from the way he acted, if I turned out to be the next one to end up in a psychoanalysis with Mr. Hood. And when I told Dorothy, she said it would do him a world of good, because I would know what to do in such a case, and he would get somewheres at last. So I may even turn out to be similar to the great inspirations of history. Well, the next thing I had to do was join the Lucy Stone League so that I could keep my own maiden name after matrimony, because a girl's name should be sacred, and when she uses her husband's, it only sinks her identity. And when a girl always insists on her own maiden name, with violence, it lets people know that she must be important someplace or other. And quite a good place to insist on an unmarried name is when you go to some strange hotel accompanied by a husband. Because when the room clerk notes that a girl with a maiden name is in the same room with a gentleman, It starts quite a little explanation and makes a girl feel quite prominent before everybody in the lobby. But Dorothy said I had better be careful. I mean, she says that most Lucy Stoners do not really worry the room clerk, because they are generally the type that are only brought to hotels on account of matrimony. But Dorothy said that when Henry and I waltz in and ask for a room with my maiden name, the clerk would probably take one good look at me and hand Henry a room in the local jail for the Mann Act. But I do not listen to any advice about literature from a girl like Dorothy, and so I joined it, and now I can write my book without my identity being sunk by having the name of a husband to crush me. Chapter 3 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, when I finally became literary, I decided that I would not be the kind of an authoress who leaves the world no better off than it was in the first place by being destructive. But I would always try to teach some lesson that would make it even better. And the best lesson I have ever come in contact with is the life of my girlfriend, Dorothy. So I decided to write about that. Only, the life of Dorothy is not going to be so much for girls to resemble as it is to give them a warning what they should stop doing. I mean, in the first place, Dorothy was born in quite a low environment, and a low environment is all very cute in the cinema, for Mary Pickford can be rescued out of even an ash can and still turn out refreshing at the finish by marrying some wealthy millionaire. But although Dorothy has improved her environment from quite a low one to the Ritz Hotel, even living at the Ritz has not improved Dorothy's ideals. For she does nothing but fall madly in love with the kind of gentlemen who were born without money and have not made any since. Well, when I told Henry that I was going to write the life of Dorothy, we had quite a little quarrel, because Henry seemed to think that the world would only be the better off for not knowing the life of a girl like Dorothy. I mean, Henry is quite broad-minded like all the great reformers have to be in order to look at both sides of the same thing at once. And he really does not mind what a girl has been through, as long as she does not enjoy herself at the finish. But Henry said that when girls like Dorothy do not pay and pay, how are all the moral people going to get their satisfaction out of watching them suffer? And what would happen to Christianity? But I finally persuaded Henry to let me write it, for I said that he could read it all over and give it a sanction before it ever reached the public. So, if it does reach the public, it means that the girls can know with safety before they begin to read that they are going to learn something to their advantage. Well, the first thing that Dorothy remembers about her life was when she was a small child. She and her father belonged to what was known as the Greater Pacific Street Fair and Carnival Company on the Pacific Coast, because it seems that whenever the Knights of Pythias or the Lithuanian Church in some small-sized town wish to hold a carnival for the benefit of something, they communicate with companies that make a profession of doing nothing but travel around and hold carnivals. And these companies are only supposed to supply the merry-go-rounds and freaks and Cupid dolls, but I think their real profession lies in deceiving the public. Because Dorothy says that after the benefit was over, the Knights of Pythias or the Lithuanian Church would be in such a crippled financial condition that they could not afford another benefit for years and years. Well, it seems that in every carnival company, there is some gentleman who does something free to amuse or instruct the public, like wearing pink spangled tights, for instance, and jumping off the post office roof into a tank full of water. And the one who did that in their carnival company was nobody less than Dorothy's father, Mr. Shaw. So I had to ask Dorothy if her father never came to grief doing such an operation. And it seems that one time he did have quite a little accident because he was always in a chronic state of being intoxicated, and he made a mistake in the hour and jumped off the post office roof before they had filled the tank yet. But Dorothy says it didn't hurt him much because it was just a case of tank meet tank, and her father had had enough in him to make up for the other one being empty. Well, it seems that while Dorothy's father was jumping off roofs, Dorothy's mother spent her time in quite an expensive flat at San Francisco. But she was so undomestic that she could hardly stand anything in the way of a husband, although every once in a while she would suddenly get quite maternal and send for Dorothy. So then Dorothy's father would put her on the train to San Francisco in the charge of some railroad conductor, and Dorothy's mother would meet her at the station with a wealthy gentleman acquaintance of hers who seemed to be inseparable. And they would be all enthusiasm over Dorothy and buy her delightful clothes and take her out to the races and roadhouses and show her off to everybody and drink her health in champagne. But in the midst of some party, Dorothy's mother and her gentleman friend would gradually begin to lose all of their maternal instincts, and they would finally end up by sending Dorothy back to the flat in charge of a messenger boy. And then Dorothy's mother would neglect coming home herself, and Dorothy would be left alone for days in the flat with a Chinaman cook who did nothing but mark Chinese lottery tickets that might just as well have been Greek to a small child of Dorothy's age. So Dorothy would be more than delighted when her mother finally remembered to come home and send her back to the carnival company. Well, when Dorothy was about 12 years of age, her father received a telegram that his wife had suddenly passed away when the grandstand collapsed at the Tijuana racetrack. And Dorothy says the only bet her father ever won on the races was when he bet that a prominent San Francisco millionaire was also among the casualty, because it turned out that he was. And that was the end of Dorothy's mother. But I do not think that Dorothy's mother was all that she should be, or she would not have allowed the kitchen help to indulge in lotteries. Well, by the time Dorothy was 14, she could always go round here and there in the fairgrounds and lend a helping hand, because they had what is called concessions, which means people would throw rings at a lot of knives, for instance, and the one who really did it won the knife. So Dorothy would mix up with the crowd and be the one that won the knife, and then she would go around to the rear and give the knife back to the gentleman who ran the concession, because Dorothy says, after all, the knives cost nearly $2 a gross, so what was the use of wasting them? But I told Dorothy that that is what I would call cheating the public. But Dorothy says it wasn't cheating them so much, because the blades of the knife were only made of tinfoil anyway, and would do nobody any good who was interested in cutting. Well, finally, when Dorothy became about the age of 15, her father came to grief. I mean, Mr. Shaw had to get married again. And it is quite an interesting story that seemed to occur because of the main attraction of the carnival company that was called the Lover's Leap. Well, this Lover's Leap consisted of a track which was in the shape of a large loop-the-loop, with a small automobile that ran on it. So after the automobile had looped the loop, it took quite a long jump in the air and landed on quite a high landing at quite a long distance. But what really intrigued the public was the blonde girl in a linen duster that sat in it. For this girl was supposed to be looping the loop in order to meet her lover, and her lover was nobody else but Mr. Shaw in his pink spangled tights, who stood waiting in a pose on the landing and showed her down the steps with gallantry, while the applause would be deafening. But Dorothy says she never did find out whether they were applauding the lover's leap of the girl or the fact that her father managed to reach the bottom of the steps in his condition. Well, in order to get blonde girls to ride in the lover's leap, The carnival company would generally make use of a stage-struck waitress with a blonde wig on, but they had quite a lot of difficulty keeping in waitresses, because after a waitress had made a few lovers' leaps, her backbone would start in to collapse. So then it would become necessary for the manager of the carnival company to start associating with fresh waitresses in order to pick up another. Well, finally, in the hotel at a town called Modesto, the manager picked up a waitress who did not tell him that her mother was the landlady of the hotel, because it seems that this waitress was afraid that he would not give her the engagement if he knew that she had quite a violent mother who was opposed to a career. So this waitress, who was called Hazel, ran away with the carnival company without notifying her mother. And to make things even worse, it seems that some of the carnival company left the hotel without notifying the clerk to make out their bill. Well, the landlady arrived on the scene at the next town, and Dorothy says that when she showed up, she had blood in her eye. But, as fate would have it, she reached Main Street just as Dorothy's father was jumping off the Masonic Temple in his pink-spangled tights. And although the landlady had never paid Mr. Shaw any attention when he was stopping at her own hotel in civilian clothes, it seemed that the moment she saw him dashing off a roof in tights, she fell madly in love. Well, it finally became necessary for the management to hold conferences with Hazel's mother. But from the very first, it soon became apparent that nothing would appease her but to marry Mr. Shaw. Well, Dorothy's father had to do it to save the carnival company from the charge of abducting a waitress and non-paying of hotel bills. So they were married by the Lutheran minister and had quite a novel wedding in a lion's cage. And that was the way Dorothy came to have a stepmother. Well, the first thing that Dorothy's stepmother did was to make Hazel go back home to look out for the hotel in Modesto, because she considered that life in a carnival company would be hard on Hazel's morals. But Dorothy says that Hazel's morals had had wear and tear enough right in Modesto to take the novelty out of anything she could learn in a carnival company. But Dorothy's stepmother stayed with the carnival company and turned out to be nothing but a termagant. I mean, she never allowed Mr. Shaw to jump off any more roofs, and he began to lose all of his personality. And it finally reached the point where all Mr. Shaw could do to amuse or instruct the public was to take out a marriage license in every town they went to and be married in public, in a balloon or a cage full of tigers, to Mrs. Shaw by the local minister. So Dorothy says, if I ever hear anybody make any cracks about her having a father who was not a marrying man, to just tell them that her father held the record of the entire Pacific coast for the number of times he was legally married. But things finally went from bad to worse, because even though Mrs. Shaw was constantly a bride, her actions failed to show it. And she did nothing but disapprove of the bridegroom, even at the altar, so that sometimes the crowd at the wedding would really wonder what Mr. Shaw saw in her. For Dorothy says that hardly anybody wants to pay a quarter to see somebody get married to a pessimistic bride who is nearly the age of 50. But I do not really blame Mrs. Shaw for becoming discouraged, because, after all, Dorothy's father was never an ideal husband. I mean, he seemed to think it was an accomplishment to become intoxicated even before prohibition was dreamed of. So Mrs. Shaw began to get very fed up with the life of a carnival company and began to yearn for her own hotel, especially when she got the news that it was beginning to have a bad name. Because it seems that hardly any commercial traveler who had pretensions to any good looks ever paid Hazel his bill. And when Dorothy's stepmother heard that Hazel had changed the breakfast hour from 6:30 to 8, she decided that things had gone far enough. So she made Mr. Shaw renounce his whole career in order to be taken back and kept at the mansion house in Modesto. Well, Dorothy's stepmother offered to take Dorothy with them, but Dorothy thought it over and decided not to go, because Dorothy says that she might have been able to stand either Hazel or her stepmother or Modesto separately, but a combination of all three was beyond human endurance. Well, of course, now Dorothy had to begin to earn her own living, so the carnival company took up a collection and bought her a nickel-plated waffle machine, and the manager told Dorothy that she need not pay for the concession of running it until it was on a paying basis. So then it was arranged that Dorothy would live under the chaperonage of Mr. and Mrs. A. Lavino, who owned a concession called the Temple of Art, which was a tent where Mr. Lavino sang illustrated songs and threw illustrated song slides on his wife in white tights with long sleeves like a butterfly. And the home life of Mr. and Mrs. Lavino was ideal, because they did not go to a hotel like the rest of the carnival company, but they kept house right in their own tent, on account of being domestically inclined. And Dorothy says that she wishes sometimes that some banquet at the Colony restaurant would be delicious enough to make her forget the memory of Mrs. Lavino's stew. And the only trouble with the Lavinos was that after 17 years of married life, they still talked baby talk to each other, and sooner or later it was bound to get on Dorothy's nerves. Well, after Dorothy was settled, she and her father said goodbye, and he was taken off to be nagged at in Modesto. And he is out there yet, living with Mrs. Shaw at the mansion house, and drowning his feelings as best he can in the days of prohibition. And the greatest comfort he has is Hazel's husband, because Hazel turned out quite well and got married, and Dorothy says the only trouble with Hazel was that she was ahead of her time. I mean, nowadays all the other flappers have caught up with Hazel, and it only goes to show that she was nothing but a premature debutante after all. And she married the Catch of Modesto, who runs a newspaper office, and all of his farmers pay Hazel's husband their bills in either grapes or Bohemian hops. So Mr. Shaw and Hazel's husband love to mess about with them in the back room of the printing office and see what they can get. And only last month, on his birthday, Dorothy sent her father the finest copper still that money could buy. Well, when the waffle machine arrived at the carnival company, it had a little pamphlet inside saying that even a child could operate it, and that gave Dorothy an idea. So she used to turn the waffle machine over to some small-sized local boy of the town who was always more than delighted. But the result was that the waffle machine was generally laid away for repairs, or the small boy ate up all the profits. Well, finally, at a town called San Diego, trouble overtook the carnival company, and it was all on account of a member who was called Doc. And Doc sold a thing that was called Miracle Spot Eradicator, which was made by buying a cake of laundry soap for 5 cents at the corner grocery store and cutting it up in small-sized pieces and selling it to the public for 25 cents each, wrapped up in tinfoil. But it seems that Doc was practically always doing wrong, and he had left a trail of disturbed husbands clear across the state of California. And what finally got him into trouble at last was that he not only sold a grocer's wife in San Diego $4 worth of Miracle Spot Eradicator that he had just bought from her own husband for a nickel, but he took advantage of her in addition and stole the grocer's watch off the bedroom chiffonier. And the watch was worth $75, so it made the grocer angry, and he reported Doc to the authorities. Well, a deputy sheriff of San Diego started on the trail and caught up with the carnival company at a town called Santa Barbara. And it seems that this deputy sheriff was quite a famous character, because he not only came from quite a wealthy old family, but he also took a very great public interest in the morals of young girls who were on the verge of womanhood. And he was very prominent on the board of directors of the detention home, And the main reason that he was interested in the case of the grocer's wife was because she was a graduate from there, and the low state of her morals always seemed to intrigue him. Well, the deputy sheriff arrived at the fairgrounds in Santa Barbara quite early in the morning before any of the crowd was there, and noted Dorothy sitting under the front flap of the Lavino's tent watching Mrs. Lavino crochet a boudoir cap. Well, he came up to Mrs. Lavino to inquire about Doc, but his gaze seemed to wander more toward Dorothy. And practically from that moment, it soon became apparent that while his official position might be hounding Doc to justice, in a personal way, his mind was running more on Dorothy. And as time went on, he practically blinked his eyes at Doc, and Doc really got so bold that he became more and more of a ladies' man and flaunted his eradicator right and left, while the deputy sheriff's principal idea seemed to be to get Dorothy off in some corner and tell her that she had reached the point where it was time for somebody moral, like him, to help her get from girlhood into womanhood. And it really does seem remarkable that Dorothy had reached the age of 16 in a carnival company without the subject of life being brought to her notice. Because when I was only 13, I sang in our church choir, and practically every boy in our choir had at least mentioned the subject, and some of them had even done more. But it seems that the environment of a carnival company is not so much like a church choir, because in a carnival company, nothing is sacred, and they all went out of their way to make jokes about love in front of Dorothy so that Dorothy would laugh it off. But love is so sacred in a church choir that they never even mention it above a whisper, and it becomes more of a mystery. And when a thing is a mystery, it is always more intriguing. So there was quite a lot more love going on in our church choir than there was in Dorothy's carnival company, where nothing was sacred. So Dorothy's whole attitude about the subject was quite irreverent, at a time when she should have been worrying about the problems of a young girl and thinking about life and wondering. Chapter 4 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, I always think that when a young girl of 16 is thoughtless about what is going to happen to her in a carnival company, she is beginning to start toward the edge of a brink. And it seems that Dorothy had already made a chum out of the company's snake eater, who went by the nickname of Curly. So when she had to choose between the attentions of a wealthy deputy sheriff and the company of someone whose financial condition consisted of a box full of eating snakes, Dorothy never hesitated to do the wrong thing. And finally, the deputy sheriff became worried about Dorothy and went to Curly himself and told him that he ought to be ashamed to be constantly seen with a young girl who was just beginning to unblossom because it was putting evil thoughts into everybody's mind. Well, Curly blushed very much for a snake-eater, but he told the deputy sheriff that he and Dorothy put in all of their time having laughs together, so he had never thought about evil. But Curly thanked the deputy sheriff for putting it into his mind and promised that he would try to do better in the future. And the result was that the next time Curly encountered Dorothy, he looked at her and looked at her with quite a new look, and he finally remarked, "Well, Mug, I guess you're grown up." Well, it seems that part of Curly's occupation in the carnival company was to take a lot of handbills advertising the street fair to the farthest corner of every town and litter up the sidewalks with them. So this day it happened to be springtime, and the weather was delightful. So Curly invited Dorothy to go along too. But when they reached the residential quarter, he threw all of the handbills in an ash can and invited Dorothy to take a walk in the country instead. Well, they took a streetcar and got off at the end of the line in the country, and the sun was shining, and the sky was full of beautiful birds, and the grass was full of beautiful violets, and the environment would have made almost anybody think about love, except a girl like Dorothy. I mean, she is just the opposite to a girl like I, because when I am alone with a gentleman in almost any environment, I always keep in mind that something might happen. Well, finally Curly began to ask Dorothy, in quite an offhand manner, what she thought of the home life of Mr. and Mrs. Al Lavino, because it seems that Curly thought it was ideal, even if it did take place in a tent. But Dorothy told Curly that was because he did not have to live in the tent with them, because as far as she was concerned, she had just about reached the end of her endurance. And someday, when Al Lavino called Pearl Lavino Lambie Pie for the 29th time in one day, she was going to make violent use of a rock. Well, then Curly tried to explain to Dorothy that practically everybody feels like the Lavinos sometime in their life, and the only difference between the Lavinos and everybody else was that the Lavinos went right on feeling that way. But Dorothy told Curly that if he ever noticed her getting into any such a condition, she hoped he would train one of his snakes to bite her. Well, then Curly held his tongue for quite a while, but after a while, he told Dorothy he supposed, after all, that she was too young to be talking about any such a matter yet, so they might as well go back to the fairgrounds. But all the way back to the fairgrounds, Curly seemed to be quite depressed because he never spoke a word. And then Dorothy started in to think. And then Dorothy says she started in to wonder if she would ever reach the point of falling in love with somebody and be just as disgusting as Pearl Lavino. Well, after all, it was springtime, and the wild violets smelled quite a lot, and Dorothy says that finally she began to wonder what it would be like to have some big bozo grab you and give you a good smack. And such a way of putting it only shows how Dorothy's thoughts can be unrefined, even on the subject of love. Well, Dorothy kept on thinking until she says she finally came to a conclusion that she had heard so much about that love racket that it was about time she gave it a whirl and found out for herself if it had been over-advertised. And I really suppose you could not blame Dorothy for being skeptical, because she had spent her whole life among people who advertised to eat snakes or give away jackknives, and never lived up to their advertisement. Well, when Dorothy decided to do it, she says that the only one she could think of who would be interested was the deputy sheriff, for Curly never entered her mind as romance. And by the time they got back to the fairgrounds, the deputy sheriff was there, as usual, sitting under the back flap of the Lavino's tent, making a pretense of helping Mrs. Lavino shell peas, but in reality, he was looking in all directions for Dorothy. So as long as Dorothy had made up her mind to find out about things, she got rid of Curly and gave the deputy sheriff a kind word, for the first time since he had started to follow the carnival company. And she ended up by making an engagement to go to the cinema in town with him that night. So when nighttime came, Dorothy deserted the waffle machine, as usual, and went to town with the deputy sheriff. And it really was quite a coincidence, for the cinema was all about love, and the electric piano played Kiss Me Again, and Dorothy finally reached the point where she decided to let the deputy sheriff hold her hand. And Dorothy says that she would give $1 to know what he got out of it, because as far as she was concerned, she had just as soon hold one of her own waffles that got left out in the rain. So Dorothy kept saying to herself, "It has got to be a hell of a lot better than this, or the Lavinos haven't got a leg to stand on." But Dorothy decided not to be hasty until she had given the experiment a good trial, and she made up her mind that before she got through that night, she would let the deputy sheriff kiss her. Well, by the time they walked back to the fairgrounds, everything was deserted, and it was quite dark except for the moonlight. So they stopped in front of the Levinos' tent, and Dorothy says she let the deputy sheriff rant on about how beautiful girlhood was, especially when a girl started in to get toward womanhood. So when he finished talking himself out, she gritted her teeth and let the deputy sheriff kiss her. And after it was all over, Dorothy says she felt like a little boy who had just found out that Santa Claus was the Sunday school superintendent. Well, it seems that all of the time, Curly was hiding behind the tent, waiting to see if Dorothy got home safe. And when she let the deputy sheriff kiss her, he stepped out and told Dorothy to get to bed quite harshly. And then Curly held a long conversation walking around the fairgrounds in the dark with the deputy sheriff. Well, the next morning, the deputy sheriff appeared and told Mrs. Levino that he had telegraphed for his mother to come and get Dorothy, and that he and his mother would take her to their home in San Diego and send her to school. And when she was educated up to it, they would see what they would see, because his object was matrimony. Well, when Dorothy heard the news, she realized that it was nothing but the work of Curly. So she went to hunt him up and found him sitting alone in his canvas snake pit. So Dorothy says she started to give him hell for making an old lady like the deputy sheriff's mother take a long ride on a railroad train for a joke that was not even funny, because Dorothy could not even imagine going away with that deputy sheriff. Well, then it became Curly's turn to give Dorothy an argument, and he told her that, even if she had not noticed it, all of her friends in the carnival company worried about her a lot, because it seems that she had turned out to be nothing but a problem. And as far as Curly himself was concerned, he had just about given up the answer, because how can any girl who could hold such an innocent conversation with him about life in the morning and then go for that deputy sheriff the way Dorothy went for him the very same night in the dark, almost made Curly believe that he did not understand women. And Dorothy tried her best to think of an explanation, but there did not seem to be any. So then Curly said that, anyhow, Dorothy ought to be learning about morals, and he had begun to realize that a carnival company was no place to do it in, because hardly anything they did in a carnival company was honest. And even Dorothy herself had gotten in the habit of stealing the bill poster's paste to make waffles out of, which was no foundation for any young girl's character. So then Curly went on to say that he did not think a great deal of the deputy sheriff's brain power, but anyway, he was prominent and wealthy, and a young girl would be safe with his mother, or Al Levino's illustrated songs had given him a bum steer. So Curly told Dorothy she must show appreciation and go with them for a couple of years and learn truth and honesty, and then, if she could not stand them any longer, she could always run away and give them the slip. Well, Dorothy begged Curly and begged him to let her stay with the carnival company, and she promised that she would reform and even put an egg in the waffle dough. But then it came out that Curly himself was leaving the carnival company, because it seems that Curly had begun to realize that snake eating hardly ever got anyone anywhere, and he said that if he had only thought of it before, he might have done differently, and he might have had something to offer a girl himself. But he said that he had sent $3 to Kansas City for 1,000 German whetstones, and as soon as they arrived, he was going to strike out alone in the world and make a man of himself. Well, when Dorothy heard that Curly was going to leave, she realized that her street fair days were over, because she could not stand living with the Levinos without any comic relief. So everything seemed to work out toward one end, and Dorothy finally had to promise Curly that she would wait for the deputy sheriff's mother and look her over, and, if they seemed to be able to stand each other, she would give it a trial. But it seemed quite peculiar that all of the time, the deputy sheriff kept trying to get Dorothy back of some tent or other and give her talks. and Dorothy says she never listened to such a conglomeration of religion and poetry spoken by a man who couldn't keep his hands off a girl. And Dorothy did not know whether to mention it to Curly or not, but she was so ashamed of being such a problem that she decided she ought not to make people any more trouble. Well, the morning the deputy sheriff's mother arrived, Dorothy, Curly, the Lavinos, and the deputy sheriff went down to the station to meet her. And when she got off the train, she turned out to be a small-sized lady who looked quite harmless, and the deputy sheriff rushed up and grabbed her and kissed her. And Dorothy said that the way he went on about a mother would have made an Irish tenor sound like an ungrateful son. And it turned out that the whole carnival company were more than delighted with her, because nothing touches the heart of a carnival company like somebody's mother. And Al Lavino went from one concession to another, telling everybody, in quite a hearty voice, that the deputy sheriff's mother was a sweetheart. So that very afternoon, the deputy sheriff went out and arrested Doc at last, and everything was ready to start for San Diego the next day. Well, the carnival company felt quite depressed because Dorothy had been with them for years, and they gave her a going-away party in the main tent with Pearl Lavino's homemade cake and lemonade and a going-away present of a large-size Bible to show a deputy sheriff's mother what kind of people they have in a carnival company. And they all cried and kissed Dorothy and became quite sentimental on the subject of a mother. And they gave Dorothy good advice, to always do what Mother said. But Dorothy seemed to note that the deputy sheriff talked so much that his mother never got a chance to say anything. But so long as everybody was so full of satisfaction, Dorothy did not like to spoil their fun by making remarks. So she held her tongue, and before she hardly knew it, it was almost train time to be taken away to San Diego. And then Dorothy realized at last that she had to say goodbye to Curly. So Curly asked Dorothy to sneak out of the back flap with him, and they held their last conversation together. Well, Curly made Dorothy walk towards the snake pit in quite an offhand manner, and when he got Dorothy alone in there, he presented her with a going-away present of an armadillo basket. And an armadillo basket is the shell of a small-size animal that is born at Texas, in sections like the elbow of a stovepipe, and is lined in cerise china silk with a ribbon running from his nose to his tail to make the handle, and Dorothy had wanted one for years. But I think it is very, very cruel to kill all the little armadillos to make armadillo baskets, because I always think that people ought not to kill little animals unless they get something useful, like at least an ermine coat. Well, Dorothy thanked Curly for the armadillo basket, and then she told him that she wanted him to accept her nickel-plated waffle machine so that he could sell it and buy himself a going-away present of a folding stand to sell the German whetstones off of, to remember her by. But Curly asked Dorothy what kind of a man he would make out of himself if he started in by accepting a present from a girl. And he told her that he had made up his mind to begin selling them off of the sidewalk and work his way up. Well, suddenly they heard everybody calling, "Dorothy!" in a loud tone of voice, because it was getting late for train time. So they had to run out and be hurried to the station, and everything was such a confusion of getting on board and saying goodbye with all of Dorothy's bundles and the armadillo basket, that Dorothy can only remember Curly when he stood on the steps of the railroad train saying, "So long, pal. If I never see you again, always remember that I think you're hell." And then he had to jump off because the train was going away. But there was quite a peculiar look on Curly's face. So when Dorothy went into the car, she sat down in a seat by the deputy sheriff's mother and began to have her own thoughts. And then it suddenly came over Dorothy like a flash that Curly was in love with her. And to think that somebody she had always admired in such a virile way had gone and become soft like Al Lavino almost made Dorothy sick to her stomach. Chapter 5 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, Dorothy had the opportunity to settle down and forget the past in a small-sized city where life is pure and people's thoughts are wholesome without contamination. And when they arrived there at San Diego, the deputy sheriff escorted Doc to jail while his mother escorted Dorothy to their old family residence. And when they reached it, it turned out to be a very beautiful large wooden house of the impressive type, with 6 pointed cupolas on the roof built out of fancy scalloped shingles by their ancestors. And when Dorothy was shown to her room, it had one of the cupolas in a corner for a large bay window with dotted Swiss ruffle curtains, and there were roses all over the wallpaper and an antique whatnot with a picture of George Washington saying his prayers in a snowdrift over an old original walnut bedstead. But when the deputy sheriff's mother left her alone in it, Dorothy says the atmosphere of that room made a girl wish that somebody would mail her a pie with a file and a rope ladder in it. Well, finally a servant girl called Emma knocked on the door and asked Dorothy if she could help her unpack. So Dorothy invited her in, and while they were unpacking, Dorothy started to ask her quite a few questions. Well, it turned out that Emma was a graduate of the detention home, because the deputy sheriff loved nothing so much as giving immoral girls a new start and keeping in touch with their cases. But Emma said that someday he was going to keep in touch with her case just once too often. And when she said it, quite a dark expression came over her countenance. So Emma did not cheer Dorothy up so much, and Dorothy would have given anything if she had not promised Curly her word of honor that she would stick it out for a year. Well, when Dorothy went downstairs, she found out that the deputy sheriff's mother had just as little to say when she had an opportunity to say it as when the deputy sheriff would not let her get a word in edgewise, because living with a prominent son had sapped her vitality. And finally it came dinner time, and the deputy sheriff arrived home with a guest he had invited. And this guest was a bleach blonde secretary of quite a middle age, who had started out in his office years ago when she was only a typewriter. And it seems that in the beginning there had been a romance, and even after the romance was over, they kept on going through quite a few things together. Like one time, when he constructed some city construction and put decomposed granite where he should have put marble, this secretary had kept all of his books on the subject, and she was so full of information that he really felt as if he could hardly get along without her. And he never dared to do anything much unless he told his secretary about it first and found out what he had to do in return for being allowed to do it. So he knew that he had to consult her on the subject of Dorothy, and he decided to grit his teeth and get the introduction over as soon as possible. Well, it seems that this secretary disapproved of Dorothy from the start, and after dinner, she and the deputy sheriff went out into the front parlor and closed the folding doors, and her disapproval finally became so loud that the deputy sheriff had to take her out for a spin. So Dorothy tried to drown her feelings in a magazine, but even the Baptist Beacon could not keep the tears from coming. But from the time that the deputy sheriff came back from his spin, he really was quite changed in his attitude toward Dorothy. I mean, he behaved as if he had some great mental strain on his mind, and all his good cheer had practically vanished. And all he dared to do to Dorothy was look at her out of the corner of one eye and keep his distance. But he did not neglect Dorothy's education, for he had his mother escort her to a very exclusive school for girls only, where she could get educated up to what she was going to become. And for the first time in her life, Dorothy had the opportunity to mix with refined Christian girls of family life and learn both truth and honesty. But Dorothy really did not pick up either truth or honesty. For the very first day in school, she got into trouble because a girl who sat in front of her asked for the loan of a lead pencil, and Dorothy had a box full, so she gave the girl half of them. Well, the girls had all been warned to be suspicious of Dorothy on account of the low environment of a carnival company that she came from. So this girl reported to the teacher that Dorothy was giving away lead pencils. So the teacher told Dorothy to remain after school and held an investigation. But she found out that Dorothy did not steal them after all. So then the teacher explained to Dorothy that the appearance of evil is just as much to be avoided, and she should try to do better in the future. And Dorothy says that while she was in that school, she was reported just like a murder trial. And the climax came one day when she was in the yard with some of the girls, and they started talking risque, as usual. Only those girls did not tell risque stories that had a plot, and came to some cute point that was amusing, but they loved to talk risque, just for the sake of being surreptitious. Well, Dorothy soon got enough of that kind of conversation, but they seemed to be enjoying themselves so highly that Dorothy says she thought it would be a treat to tell them a story that was really funny. But, much to her surprise, it shocked the girls very much to make light of such a subject. So they reported Dorothy to the teacher for removing the bloom off of things that young girls ought not to mention. So Dorothy was sent to the principal's office, and he told her that he would have to expel her if pure girls from Christian homes got their thoughts contaminated. And he asked Dorothy if she had not learned what it meant to be a Christian since arriving at San Diego. So Dorothy said that, as far as she could gather, it meant everything was okay so long as you don't admit you enjoy it. Well, then the principal told Dorothy to wait in his office while he went downstairs to talk her morals over with the whole class. But as he went out of the door, he looked back and shook his finger at Dorothy and threw her a smile and said, "You little heathen." So I think he really would have liked to work up a small flirtation if he had the virility. Well, the principal went down to Dorothy's class and told all the girls that Dorothy had not had the advantage of a pure home, so they must form themselves into a little committee and help her not to stray. And after that, Dorothy really became the center of attraction until one of the girls took a false step with the visiting football team, and Dorothy lost her novelty. But Dorothy really took no interest in her opportunities, and she finally started in to play hooky and wander around the city zoo, where the perfume made her remember the carnival company, and the animals took her mind off of native San Diegans. And things finally began to get worse in the home, because Emma started giving the deputy sheriff darker and darker looks, accompanied by low-voiced remarks to herself that could be overheard. And what Emma principally mumbled about was the injustice when a girl like Dorothy lived in luxury in a delightful bedroom and had beautiful clothes, while Emma had not only endured the deputy sheriff, but was expected to be an experienced chambermaid in addition. And it finally reached a point where the deputy sheriff would really have given Emma her notice, but he could not do it on account of the way that chambermaids talk. And the deputy sheriff got practically no relief when he dropped in at his office and had to listen to his bleach-blonde secretary make unpleasant remarks about city constructions he had constructed and about an act called the Man Act that he had indulged in with her once by traveling from one state to another. But things really could not go on forever, and gradually the deputy sheriff started in to get used to his great mental strain. And little by little, he began to cast eyes at Dorothy and be himself again. And finally, one evening, he threw off all care and decided to hear Dorothy say her prayers in a nightgown. So Dorothy had to do it, and after she got through, the deputy sheriff decided to tuck her in and sit on the bedside and talk about the purity of girlhood. But his actions started to belie his words, and Dorothy was just getting ready to jump up and holler out of the cupola when the deputy sheriff suddenly began to look peculiar and fell over in a lurch on account of some poison that Emma had put in his coffee. Well, they sent for the doctor, and when the deputy sheriff started in to feel better, the first thing he did was to tell everybody to keep their mouths shut and say he was taken down with a bad case of pneumonia. But he used his magnanimity on Emma, for he did not arrest her, and he only sent her back to the detention home to keep the publicity from breaking out at a trial. But when the deputy sheriff's secretary found out what had occurred, she decided to nurse him back to health, and nothing could stop her. So she moved into the house, bag and baggage, and used so much authority that everything went under her thumb. I mean, everything except Dorothy, because she really started in to encourage Dorothy to look for trouble on the outside, and it did not take Dorothy long to find it. Chapter 6 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, a dramatic traveling company had come to San Diego called the Frederick Morgan Players. And one Wednesday afternoon, when Dorothy was playing hooky from school, as usual, she attended the matinee. Well, the production that day was called The Tale of Two Cities, and the gentleman who portrayed the title role was Frederick Morgan himself. And Frederick Morgan had the type of a personality that, as soon as he came out on the stage, everybody knew he was there, because he had the habit of walking on backwards so that the audience could not see his face. And as soon as he felt that they could hardly stand the suspense any longer, he would suddenly turn around quick and hold a pose. And Dorothy says when he did it, the thrill that went down her spine almost made her think that the back of her chair had been wired for electricity. Well, Dorothy sat there like a trance and never took her eyes off the drama. And by the time Frederick Morgan had reached the last act, where he stood on the steps and said that he was doing a better thing than he had ever done by getting hanged, the whole subject of sex appeal had taken on quite a new aspect to Dorothy. And Dorothy says she decided that all of the things the deputy sheriff had tried on her that only made her squirm would be a horse of a different color with that leading man in the role. So after the matinee, Dorothy went out and stood in the lobby to gaze at his photograph. And, as fate would have it, it seems that Frederick Morgan also had quite a habit of hurrying out in the lobby after the matinee to loiter around his photograph. So when he saw Dorothy admiring it too, he realized that they had something that was common, and he gave her a kind word. And one thing led to another until Mr. Morgan invited Dorothy to have a Coca-Cola in the back of a drugstore and tell him her life. And from the moment he heard that Dorothy was raised in a carnival company, with quite an acrobatic father, he had a fellow feeling, and he asked her if she would like to go back to that profession. And Dorothy was in such a seventh heaven of delight that she said yes to an offer of $12 a week. Well, Dorothy did not even have to bother to run away from home, because the deputy sheriff convalesced. But his spirits never came back, and he obeyed everything his bleach-blonde secretary told him to the letter. So when she told him that Dorothy's heart was set on a career, he held a conversation with Dorothy and said that, the way things had turned out, he could not do as he wished anyway, so he would not try to stop her. And Dorothy left the only refined home she ever had to move into the kind of a rooming house that charges actors $7 a week. And 2 days after she left, Dorothy noted a headline in the San Diego Union which said, "Deputy Sheriff wins secretary after whirlwind courtship." And that was how Dorothy threw away the opportunity of becoming a wealthy gentleman's bride, to start rehearsing the role of an extra girl in a barroom scene of a play called On the Yukon. Well, things went on until the following week, when they started to produce a prominent Broadway success, where Frederick Morgan portrayed the role of a light-hearted Irishman of the tenor type, who could not keep from kissing every girl he passed. And he gave Dorothy the role of a girl that he passed in the second act. Well, all week at rehearsal, Mr. Morgan did not bother to perform the business, but the day the dress rehearsal arrived, he started to put in the feeling. And when he did, there was no doubt left in Dorothy's mind that she liked it. And it seems that Mr. Morgan himself suddenly started to look at Dorothy in a new light, and the result was that both of them highly enjoyed the engagement. But by the time they had played that second act for a few performances, they finally reached a point where something had to be done. So after the show on Wednesday night, Mr. Morgan invited Dorothy to accompany him to a lunch wagon for a hamburger sandwich. And Dorothy seemed to note that when Mr. Morgan gave the waiter their order, he told him to leave out the onions. Well, after they finished their sandwiches, Mr. Morgan told Dorothy that he had something to say, so she had better come up to his apartment. So Dorothy went. And when he got Dorothy up there, he started to tell her the story of his life. And it seems that, in reality, he had a wife, but an artist cannot marry, so he had to send her back where he got her from, because an artist must use all of his feelings to develop his temperament by. And then he told Dorothy that she would probably turn out to be an artist herself, as soon as she got her temperament developed and found out about life. And he said that he himself would be willing to teach her about life, and gave her all his aid. And he told her it was really quite a large opportunity for a girl like her when society women with strings of pearls were after it. So after he finished his recommendation, he asked Dorothy whether she would like to go home or take off her things and stay a while. So Dorothy took off her things. Chapter 7 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, Dorothy says that as far as either she or the public or the critics could note, there was no more temperament in her interpretations after she learned about life than there had been before. But I think that what really was the matter with Dorothy was that learning about life did not turn out to be so enjoyable to her after all. I mean, Dorothy is never at her best in a tete-a-tete, and nobody realized it more than Mr. Morgan, so they just let the matter drop. Well, one week the company played at a town called Monterey that is famous for having exclusive hotels full of the best people, and at one of them was a polo team from New York. And the captain of the polo team was nobody else but Charlie Breen, of the famous wealthy Breen family. Well, one day the polo team had gotten up for early morning practice, and that gave them time to become even more intoxicated by evening than usual. So in the evening, they went up to Monterey to attend the Frederick Morgan players. But they paid very little attention to the plot and made rude remarks to the actors. And when the villain started to attack Mr. Morgan, Charlie Breen called out to sock him on the bustle. Well, things went from bad to worse until finally Dorothy made her entrance in the role of a maid who answered the telephone. And then the polo team began to sit up and take an interest in the drama. Well, their enthusiasm for Dorothy rose by leaps and bounds, and by the time she made her exit, they would not even let the performance proceed. So I really believe that learning about life must have developed Dorothy's art after all. Well, the polo team consulted their programs to learn who Dorothy was. So then they started a little chant in unison and said, "We want Dorothy, we want Dorothy, we want Dorothy." and nothing could stop them. But they were so prominent that they could not be ejected. So finally, Mr. Morgan had to send Dorothy out in front to sit with the polo team in order to keep them quiet so that he could act. And Dorothy was not needed on the stage anymore, as that was the last time the telephone had to ring in that drama. Well, from the moment Dorothy joined the polo team, they calmed down and were all perfect gentlemen, especially Charlie Breen, because it seems that he had fallen madly in love with Dorothy at first sight. But even when Charlie calmed down, the liquor still rose to the surface, and he kept breathing quite heavy breaths in Dorothy's direction and leaning on her support and mumbling remarks that did not seem to connect with each other. And that always bores a girl like Dorothy. So after the performance, when they invited her to accompany them to a champagne supper, she gave them the slip to go out with the property man. And Dorothy says that running out on millionaires has been her specialty ever since. Well, the next day, the polo team left for the South. But Charlie Breen did not forget the girl he had learned to care for he wrote her a letter telling her to go right to New York and get into the Ziegfeld Follies, and he would see her there later. And in the letter was a letter of introduction to a New York broker who knew Mr. Ziegfeld and a check for $1,000. But Dorothy paid no attention to the letter or the check because Dorothy was so ignorant that she thought that money had to be in dollars and cents. I mean, I am just the reverse, because I always seem to know those things by instinct. Well, one night Dorothy and the character actress of the company were packing up to go to Sacramento when Dorothy happened to run across the letter from Charlie Breen, so she showed it to the character actress. Well, it seems that this character actress had met a wealthy lumber magnate once in the heyday of her youth. So she knew what a check was, and she explained it to Dorothy and advised her to go to New York and do everything the gentleman said. And she helped Dorothy to get ready with the aid of a home dressmaker who went out by the day at Sacramento. But when it came time to leave for New York, Dorothy decided that after all, Mr. Morgan had really done the best of his ability to improve her art. So she bought him a gold-headed cane, because Dorothy is the kind of a girl that makes gentlemen presents. But I really try not to blame her, because I have a very broad mind, and I always use psychology, so I understand that there are some people in the world who cannot help it if their instincts are unnatural. But I almost have to shudder when I think of poor Dorothy starting out all alone for a large-sized city full of cuter girls than she was, with less than $1,000 in her pocket and practically the wrong ideas about everything. Chapter 8 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, Dorothy had never learned how to dress, and at a time when most girls ought to be wearing either pink or blue, Dorothy selected red, which gave her such a violent appearance that gentlemen knew at a glance she was not the kind of a girl that needs any aid. For red may make gentlemen look, but nothing holds their interest like pink or blue. And instead of trying to make gentlemen acquaintances herself that would broaden her out, Dorothy spent most of her time on the train going to New York listening to a Pullman porter tell amusing experiences in a colored dialect, so that when Dorothy arrived in New York, she had not made a single gentleman acquaintance to give her a helping hand. But Dorothy was full of confidence, and she did not know she did not look like other girls. And the worst mistake she made was that instead of carrying a small valise or a vanity case or even a pocketbook, Dorothy had all of her things in her armadillo basket. Well, when Dorothy came out of the Grand Central Station, she got over onto 45th Street and started to look for a hotel, and the first one she came to, she started to go in. But the taxi starter out in front took one look at the armadillo basket and detained her, for he said they did not allow animals in that hotel. So Dorothy told him that it was nothing but a dead armadillo that couldn't have harmed him in its palmiest days. But he told her that they had never had an armadillo in their hotel, dead or alive, and who did she think she was to break the ruling? Well, Dorothy loves nothing so much as an argument, so she told him that if his hotel allowed alligator valises, where did they get off to discriminate against an armadillo? But Dorothy says she couldn't make him realize that he didn't have a leg to stand on, and quite a crowd began to gather, so she had to move on. Well, the next hotel she came to was a very refined hotel for middle-aged ladies. And there were quite a few elderly ladies in the lobby when Dorothy went in. Well, Dorothy hung the armadillo basket on the arm of a chair while she was awaiting the hotel clerk, and one of the elderly ladies happened to go over to the chair and take a seat. But just as she was taking it, she suddenly seemed to catch sight of the armadillo and fainted. And after the confusion was over, the hotel clerk gave Dorothy quite a dark look and told her that all of their rooms were occupied. So then Dorothy went around the corner to try her luck on 44th Street. But I really believe that she never would have found an exclusive hotel to accept her, but that fate always helps a girl like Dorothy. Because the next hotel she arrived at was the Algonquin Hotel, where all the famous actresses and movie stars live, and just as Dorothy arrived at the front door, it happened that Buster Keaton and his motion picture company were just coming in from some location, and they were still in quite amusing comedy makeups. So when Dorothy went into the lobby, the room clerk thought that she belonged to the comedy company and gave her a room, and he never discovered his mistake until everybody else had cleaned up for dinner. But then it was too late to put Dorothy out, because possession is 10 points of the law. Well, when Dorothy came down for dinner, she seemed to note that she was the center of regard. So she says she gave them all a large, dirty look for being so rude as to stare at a girl merely because she is well dressed. And she walked quite haughtily into the special dining room that is reserved for nobody but famous actors and literary people, and when George, the famous head waiter, saw her, he became so dazed that he showed her to a table. So Dorothy ordered lobster salad and chicken salad and fruit salad for dinner and decided that she was a woman of the world at last. Well, Dorothy began to get friendly with her waiter as usual, and the first thing she told him was that she had come to New York to go into the Follies. So the waiter told George, and when all the famous people asked George who Dorothy was, and George told them that she was a girl who thought she was going to get in the Follies, they were all quite amused. And finally, Dorothy became the joke of the whole Algonquin Hotel. And the literary round table of famous critics were really more amused than anyone, because one of their most literary writers, Mr. Peter Hood himself, was trying to get a girl that he knew into the Follies who really had something to offer. And he had learned how hard it is to get to Mr. Ziegfeld with an introduction. Well, this girl was a beautiful, tall imitation Russian countess of the vampire type, and she had black hair and black eyes and quite a desperate kind of an anti-Bolshevik expression, with a leaning towards long antique earrings. And Dorothy says you had to give her credit, because she had almost solved the problem of how to look well-groomed without the use of water. And wherever she went, people simply had to look at her and ask one another who she was. And what was even more unusual, she was also full of brains, for she could talk for hours and hours on almost any kind of subject. But the best thing she knew how to do was to hold conversations with gentlemen about love. I mean, with one gentleman at a time, and she could really be just as talkative on the subject of love as the girl in the great novel called The Green Hat. Well, Of course, she was really much too dramatic to go into the Follies, but she could not act in a dramatic drama on account of quite a heavy European dialect. But as soon as she learned to talk more like an American, she was going to show we Americans her interpretation of what famous writers like Mr. Strindberg meant. And she could hardly wait to get into the Follies and meet wealthy brokers who are fond of art and would finance her own company. Well, it was no wonder that the whole round table thought she was divine, and Peter Hood, who made her discovery, could never seem to get over it, because the first night he met with her, he brought her to one of those literary parties, where all the Algonquin writers who rack their brains hard all day being amusing keep right on racking their brains hard all night doing a thing called charades, because they never seem to sit down and relax. Well, in the midst of one of the amusing charades, one of the great writers who thought it up became excited over his success and dropped a lighted candle onto some of the cute kind of paper caps that come out of bonbons. So the paper caps caught fire, and everybody had to run out in a panic. But after they all got down in the street and counted themselves over, they found out that one of them was missing. Well, they finally realized that it was the Russian Countess, and Peter Hood decided that, as long as he was her escort, he really ought to save her life. So he ran back into the building, and when he reached the apartment where the fire was, there sat the Countess, gazing at it in a reverie, and saying in quite a distant voice, "Is not flame beautiful?" Well, when Peter Hood heard her say a little thing like that at a time like that, he knew that she was not like other beautiful girls, for she was full of soul besides. And he stood there in a daze and looked at her, but by this time all the cute paper caps had dwindled down to cinders and the fire was out. Well, from that moment, they all realized that she was a genius. So she was the girl that the whole round table was raving about when Dorothy arrived at the Algonquin. And they all kept making engagements with Mr. Ziegfeld to meet her. But he always seemed to be out, so it was no wonder they had to laugh at a girl like Dorothy. Well, the first morning, Dorothy called up the broker friend of Charlie Breen and told him that she had a letter of introduction to him. Well, when his broker talked to Dorothy over the phone, he was more than delighted, because there is nothing a broker enjoys so much as getting a girl an introduction to Mr. Ziegfeld. So he said he would be right over to get Dorothy and take her out to luncheon at the Ritz. But when he met Dorothy in the lobby of the Algonquin, he looked at her, and he really began to lose some of his interest. Because by that time, Dorothy had discovered the imitation jewelry department at Bloomingdale's, and her appearance was even more unusual than usual. So he ended up by taking her to an artistic tea room where the way she was dressed would not be noticed. But Dorothy does not know how to hold the interest of a broker, because Dorothy always seems to want to make a broker laugh, which is fatal in itself. I mean, the only time that brokers really want to laugh is at a show, or when they are telling each other risque stories on the stock exchange. For when a broker meets a girl, he always wants to be more serious and give her good advice. So the first thing this broker did was to tell Dorothy that New York was a very, very wicked place. But instead of listening to him with reverence, Dorothy asked if he could give her some good addresses. So that really brought the conversations to quite a halt. But the broker finally overlooked her error and got to feeling better. So then he told Dorothy that she should be very, very careful about what gentleman she met and to always ask him first whether she ought to or not. So Dorothy told him that the only one who had given her a tumble was the elevator boy at the Algonquin, but she said that if he had any objections to the elevator boy, she would take to using the staircase. So the broker began to feel very uncomfortable with a girl who did not have any awe, but he finally concentrated on his friendship for Charlie Breen and said that he would try to help her. Well, it turned out that this broker's only real connection with Mr. Ziegfeld was that both he and Mr. Ziegfeld used the same lawyer. So he invited Dorothy and the lawyer to dine, and they went out to Arrowhead. Well, this lawyer looked Dorothy over during the dinner, and then he told her that he had just recommended a bootlegger to Mr. Ziegfeld, whose scotch turned out to be full of wood alcohol, so it would do no girl any good to have a letter of recommendation from him. So that all came to nothing. Well, Dorothy finally reached the point where her money had run out. But Dorothy's poverty always seems to consist in not worrying about bills, so she went right on as usual, spending most of her time in the lobby of the Algonquin Hotel, becoming more and more of a chum to the elevator boy. And everybody who went in or out of the elevator always used to stop and say to Dorothy, "Well, Miss Shaw, when do you go to work for Mr. Ziegfeld?" Until really Dorothy began to feel quite annoyed. So one morning, she walked over to Mr. Ziegfeld's offices at the New Amsterdam Theater and became friendly with the office boy and asked him if he could get her an introduction to Mr. Ziegfeld. Well, the office boy told Dorothy to wait while he went into Mr. Ziegfeld's office. And finally Dorothy noted a crack appear in the doorway, and the crack finally disappeared, but the office boy came out again and told Dorothy that she could enter. And that was how Dorothy came to meet Mr. Ziegfeld. Well, what happened to Dorothy really seems like almost a miracle, because Mr. Ziegfeld got her to stand up in quite a good light, and he looked her over, and he smoked his cigar and smoked his cigar, and then he finally wrote an order to Mr. Gene Buck to give her an engagement, and told her to report for rehearsal on Monday. But, after all, it was really not so much of a miracle as it was the genius of Mr. Ziegfeld, because Mr. Ziegfeld can see through all of a girl's bad points and pick out her good ones. And Dorothy says that most of the girls in the Follies would be passed up by practically every broker in New York before Mr. Ziegfeld has glorified them. Because when brokers are left to themselves, they always make a mistake and pick out some sophisticated girl that is quite well groomed, and then keep on wondering what is the matter with her. Because hardly any broker seems to have enough psychology to realize that the real ideal of his dreams is some small-town village belle that he used to weave a romance around when he was the age of 16. But Mr. Ziegfeld knows all about psychology, so that is the kind he picks out. And Dorothy says that about all Mr. Ziegfeld does to glorify them is to get them to comb the hay out of their hair and give up starch in lingerie. And as far as their street gowns are concerned, Dorothy says that Mr. Ziegfeld would always rather have a girl get her models from Paris, Kentucky, than Paris, France, because nobody knows better than Mr. Ziegfeld that there is much more glamour for brokers in dotted Swiss than there ever is in crepe de chine. And the result of it is that a crowd of Follies girls off of the stage looks like nothing so much as a small-town Sunday school picnic. And it really is a waste of time to get letters of introduction to Mr. Ziegfeld, because he gets over 20,000 of them every year, and Dorothy says that a composite photo of the whole 20,000 wouldn't even be blurred, because they practically all say, "Dear Mr. Ziegfeld, this will introduce Miss Blank, in whom I have no other interest except to assist a little girl who is full of ambition and helping to support her family." So Dorothy says that when Mr. Ziegfeld gets any such letter, it generally means that the little girl arrives in a Rolls Royce and that she has already been glorified with the aid of Mr. Bendel or Mr. Tapé. to a point where she has lost all of her own identity. And Dorothy says that Mr. Ziegfeld's best girls wander in on their own from 42nd Street, just like she did. Well, after Dorothy got her engagement, she went back to the Algonquin Hotel, and in the lobby, she met Mr. Hood, the discoverer of the famous Russian countess. So he came up to Dorothy as usual and said, "Well, Miss Shaw, when do you start in to rehearse for Mr. Ziegfeld?" So when Dorothy said, "Monday," he did not believe his ears. And so Dorothy showed him Mr. Ziegfeld's note to Mr. Buck. Well, then he nearly fell dead. So the news got all around the lobby, and they all nearly fell dead. But when the Russian countess heard about it, she really nearly fell dead, because she had spent 8 weeks in Mr. Ziegfeld's office with 10 letters of introduction and had never even got past the office boy. But Dorothy found out afterwards that whenever anybody sends Mr. Ziegfeld some girl who is intellectual, he takes quite a good look at her first through the crack of a door. And if she happens to be a vampire type in addition, they hardly ever meet personally. Because nobody knows better than Mr. Ziegfeld that the vampire type of a girl never really gets anywhere. And there has never been a vampire type in the whole Follies. I mean, even the famous Dolores, who was a very striking type of a beautiful tall brunette, was not a vampire type, but she was really a Madonna. And so it turned out that all of the Russian countess's temperament and brains never got her anywheres, because that type of a girl may interest literary gentlemen, but they are just the reverse with a broker. I mean, no broker ever really feels at home with any girl who wants to talk about such a risque subject as love. And girls who talk about love are generally more famous for the way that gentlemen try to avoid them. And the way everything turned out only proves that Mr. Ziegfeld is always right. For after all, Dorothy has become one of the most famous girls in New York, in spite of all her faults, while that Russian countess has turned out to be one of the ones who is an extra girl whenever the theater guild puts on some peasant drama about low life in Hungary. Well, when Charlie Breen's broker friend learned that Dorothy was rehearsing in the Follies, he was nearly dumbfounded. But when he got over it, he began to realize that Dorothy was quite cute after all. And Dorothy really did start in to become cuter, because it did not take Dorothy long to realize that something was wrong somewheres. So she gave all of her imitation jewelry and her red satin dress to the chambermaid, and bought herself a pink gingham model on 6th Avenue, and she finally got to look just like all the other girls in the Follies. So then it seems that Charlie Breen's broker friend started in to send telegrams to Charlie out in California, boasting about how he got Dorothy into the Follies. So that seemed to make Charlie quite angry, because he sent him quite a sarcastic telegram which read, "You make me sore. Give credit where credit is due. Who picked her out? Charles Breen." Well, Charlie started in to send Dorothy telegrams every day congratulating himself for picking her out. And it seems that he had to stay in California for the polo, and he finally won the international polo match. But he telegraphed Dorothy that the proudest day of his life would be the party he was going to have when he got to New York in honor of picking out a girl that got into the Follies. Well, while Charlie was straining every nerve hurrying to New York, Dorothy was rehearsing in the Follies. And the first thing she started out to do was to select herself a chum. But instead of becoming acquainted with famous girls who went out socially, like Peggy Hopkins, for instance, of course Dorothy started in to look farther. Well, in the Follies, there are practically always 18 Tiller girls who are in English ballet, which is noted for nothing but hard work. And they never go out anywheres socially because they have to practice all of the time, just like soldiers. And the result is that they are just like one girl on the stage and off of it. So when Dorothy was looking around for a girlfriend, that was what she picked out. I mean, Dorothy did not even pick out one Tiller girl, and I really think it was very undignified to go walking around the streets of New York with a whole English ballet when she might just as well have been riding in the Rolls-Royce of some girl with a future. But Dorothy says that one Tiller girl never goes out alone without yearning for the other 17. And the only reason Dorothy could think up for her selection is that she had never in her life heard English girls talk Cockney, so she would listen to that English ballet for hours and hours and never get through marveling. Well, one morning Charlie Breen finally arrived at New York, so he took Dorothy to luncheon, and then he had to hurry to their country estate to see his father, who was very, very low with pneumonia. But he apologized to Dorothy and told her he would be back at 10 o'clock in the evening to escort her to the party he was giving in her honor. Well, after rehearsal was over, instead of going to her room and relaxing for the party, Dorothy took a bus with her 18 Tiller girl chums and went to Coney Island. And she was having such a delightful time riding on all the concessions that she forgot to look at the clock. And she never got back to the hotel until after 12, where Charlie Breen had waited in the lobby for 2 hours and had gotten so nervous that he was almost ready to scream. And he finally had to escort Dorothy to a refined party full of brokers and cute girls in evening gowns, with large holes in her stockings from sliding down the Devil's Slide and practically a dislocated hip. Chapter 9 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, Dorothy opened in the Follies, and Charlie Breen fell more madly in love than usual. So one night he took her for a long ride around Central Park in a closed taxi and asked her what she wanted to do about it. Well, it seems that Dorothy did not want to do anything except get out of the taxi, because Dorothy is the cool type of temperament who quite frequently thinks that two is a crowd. But Dorothy hated to hurt Charlie's feelings, so she told him a fib. I mean, she said that she was quite a violent Catholic, and she could not do anything that might make some Catholic priest raise his eyebrows in the confessional. Well, when Charlie found out that Dorothy was not only pure, but even religious, his love turned into reverence, and his intentions became matrimonial. So he went to his mother and held quite a long conversation of the subject of matrimony and the wonderful girl that had come into his life. Well, it seems that Charlie Breen's mother had always been quite anxious for him to be married and settle down and drink in his own home instead of in nightclubs, where everybody saw him disgrace the old family name. But Mrs. Breen's choice and Charlie's never seemed to light on the same girl, because Mrs. Breen preferred a girl called Muriel Devenant, whose ancestors had moved in the same social set with theirs. And Muriel would make an ideal wife because she did not care for the boys and spent all of her time with girlfriends. But I always think that Muriel really did have a small feeling for the boys after all, because the girlfriends she chose always seemed to resemble boys as closely as possible. Anyway, she was willing to strain a point and marry Charlie Breen because of his money. But the main reason Mrs. Breen wanted to have Muriel for a daughter-in-law was because she always knew how to do the right thing at the right time in society. But Charlie explained to his mother that doing the right thing at the right time in society was only enjoyable if you enjoyed it. But when you did not, it was only a hollow sham, so he preferred a girl like Dorothy. Well, Mrs. Breen finally became very sweet and told Charlie that she only wanted him to marry the girl of his choice. So she told him to bring Dorothy home first and give all the family the opportunity to make her acquaintance. Because it seems that even if Mrs. Breen is very aristocratic, her ideas are quite broad-minded for being so wealthy, and she will always invite somebody to the house as long as he does something, and when she gets him there, she always tries to make him feel as if he was almost as important as society people who do not have to do anything to be prominent. And whenever Charlie fell madly in love with some new girl in the Follies, Mrs. Breen always liked to have him bring her home. And when she got there, she would be very, very sweet and draw her out in conversation about literature and music and art so that Charlie could see how well she would fit into such a cultured environment. But every time that Mrs. Breen did it, something fatal always seemed to happen, because after his mother got through with a Follies girl, Charlie would always decide to listen to his second thoughts about weaving a romance about a girl like that. Well, Mrs. Breen was so anxious to have Dorothy meet her that she told Charlie to bring Dorothy home to a family dinner. And when the family got through with her, they would have all their society friends come in after dinner and meet Dorothy socially. And in order to brighten things up, she would have some chamber music by a string quartet, because Mrs. Breen said that, so long as Dorothy was in a musical show, she would be sure to love a string quartet. But of course, Mrs. Breen did not know that there is hardly anything about a string quartet that appeals to a girl like Dorothy. But Charlie is such a sweet boy that he thought his mother's idea was quite charming. Well, just going into the old Breen family mansion on Fifth Avenue ought to make a girl feel as if she was getting somewheres, because you have to be shown through 3 separate doors, and the first 2 of them are iron. But when Charlie showed Dorothy through them, all Dorothy could think of was that the Breen family were giving themselves 3 separate chances to throw her out, and she began to lose some of her self-possession. Well, after they got past the 3rd door, the butler started to lead them through quite a long, hollow hallway that had nothing to relieve it but some life-size crockery baby elephants that only made Dorothy feel more unimpressive. But they finally reached the old family library, and under an electric lamp sat the father of Charlie Breen. But Dorothy says that, after all the suspense, Charlie's father was not such a climax. I mean, he is the kind of a gentleman who has never done anything in his life, either one way or another, and the Breen family were always holding him up to Charlie as an example of what he could keep from doing if he would only concentrate his mind on it. Well, Dorothy looked Mr. Breen over, and she began to feel quite a little better, and Mr. Breen told Dorothy that he was pleased to meet her because somebody had taken him to a Follies once 5 years ago, and he really could not remember when he had ever had such an enjoyable evening. So Dorothy spoke up and said, "If you feel that way about it, why don't you take a long chance and try going again?" So Mr. Breen said that that was really quite a bright idea, and he wondered why he had never thought of it. And while he was wondering, Mrs. Breen came in. Well, Mrs. Breen was really more than sweet to Dorothy, for she made conversation just as if Dorothy were an equal. And first, she asked Dorothy her opinion of quite a few rare old first editions of antique classic books they had in their library. And when Mrs. Breen asks for an opinion, she is always polite enough to stop and wait for a reply. But Dorothy did not have any, and the atmosphere became quite strained. I mean, Dorothy does not know enough about etiquette to know that any time a girl feels like she has nothing to say, the best thing to do is to ask for a glass of water. And asking for a glass of water where it was quite inconvenient to find one would have made Dorothy feel quite important. Well, after Mrs. Breen saw that Dorothy had become as uncomfortable as she could be in a library, she invited her into the art gallery to show her a new picture she had just bought by the famous Spanish artist called Zuluago. And Mrs. Breen told Dorothy to look it over carefully and then tell her what she thought of its chiaroscuro. Well, Dorothy had practically no thoughts on the subject, but she suddenly got quite a bright idea and asked Charlie what he thought of it. So Charlie spoke up and said, By Jove, I don't know what it is. Well, of course, it made Mrs. Breen look quite small that any son of hers was so uncultured, so she really had to bite her lip. But she became sweeter than ever to Dorothy and told her that she had arranged quite a little surprise for her. And that surprise was that she had invited Jefferson Breen, the famous uncle of Charlie, who is not only the head of the whole Breen family, but one of the most impressive Americans of the age, to come and look her over at dinner. Well, while they were waiting for Jefferson Breen to arrive and look Dorothy over, the famous debutante, Muriel Devenant, came in and did it. Well, Muriel seemed to be delighted with Dorothy from the start, for she greeted her in quite a hearty tone and shook Dorothy's hand in quite a strong grasp that Dorothy says reminded her of a homesick elk meeting one of his kind in some foreign clime. But the way that Dorothy acted was the depths of being uncultured, for she backed away from Muriel in defense and began to look toward an exit. So finally even Charlie noted her disturbance, and he got Dorothy off on one side and wanted to know if anything was the matter. And Dorothy said, "Nothing that an earthquake couldn't clear up." But Charlie did not understand what she was getting at, and he began to look at Dorothy askance. Well, finally it seemed to be dinner time, and Mrs. Breen said they would not wait for Mr. Jefferson Breen, because when a gentleman holds the affairs of the nation in his pocket, he is likely to be late at any moment. So Mrs. Breen led them through 5 or 6 large-sized salons with quite slippery floors and small Armenian rugs, and Dorothy says that the only difference between her and Eliza crossing the ice was that Mrs. Breen had forgotten to order bloodhounds. Well, Dorothy said they finally arrived at the old oaken dining room, where the table was all laid out in her honor to look like a funeral. And just as they were sitting down, the great Jefferson Breen himself came in. But when he made his entrance, Dorothy realized that she had already met him at the apartment of a girl in the Follies called Gloria. Only at the apartment of Gloria, he went under the nom de plume of Mr. Jones. Well, when Jefferson Breen was introduced to Dorothy, he was really quite surprised. But he did not seem to want to mention their previous acquaintance before the family, so he said Grace instead. Well, during dinner, Jefferson Breen gave Dorothy quite a confidential talk about the evils of modern life, and he finally brought up the subject of having met Dorothy at Gloria's apartment. So he explained to Dorothy that his interest in Gloria was to help a girl from doing wrong, because he said that he had a theory that if gentlemen would give girls expensive apartments and automobiles and jewelry as a reward to keep from doing wrong, instead of the vice versa, the world would really be a better place. So he told Dorothy that that was what he was doing to Gloria. But Dorothy held her tongue because she says the only reply she could think up to that old bird couldn't be spoken out loud in a refined home. Well, then Mrs. Breen started in to ask Dorothy questions about the habits of girls in the Follies, because it seems that Mrs. Breen was so broad-minded that she did not care how much she learned about life. But Dorothy says that Mrs. Breen had the idea that Follies girls were about the same as red ants, and Dorothy did not know enough about red ants to answer her questions. Well, Dorothy tried to give Charlie a sign to think up a quick excuse to get out as soon as dinner was over, but Charlie did not understand because it seems that he thought they were giving Dorothy a pleasant evening. Well, dinner was no sooner over than the string quartet arrived, and then society people began to pour in for the musical evening. And Mrs. Breen was so sweet to Dorothy that she picked out the most titled aristocrats to introduce her to, even if Dorothy did not know what to call them. But instead of taking the opportunity of making friends, Dorothy only let everybody see her misery. And the kind of an expression that Dorothy wears on her face when she is on the verge of standing more than she can bear almost gives a person the impression that she is cross-eyed. So the society people began to leave Dorothy severely alone, and Mrs. Breen kept Charlie busy putting small gilt chairs all over the salon so that he could not join Dorothy and keep her company. And every time he looked at Dorothy across the salon, she was sitting all alone, looking quite unpopular, with a very unbecoming expression on her countenance. And I am really afraid that Charlie was beginning to wonder. Well, finally Mrs. Breen came over to Dorothy and told her that she ought to smile and enjoy herself and join in the conversation. But Dorothy does not know how to make an effort and smile in society like the rest of us have to do. And finally, the string quartet started in to play something that was called on the program a Bach fudge, and Dorothy started to feel even worse. But by this time, Mrs. Breen's own troubles began, because nothing that Mrs. Breen could do would make those music lovers keep quiet. And just as soon as she got one set to hold their tongues in the hall, another would start talking about themselves in the salon, and Mrs. Breen would have to crowd her way through all the gilt chairs to tell them to hush. But by that time, the music lovers in the hall would be at it again, and Mrs. Breen would try to hush them at a distance. But it was really like water rolling off of a duck's back. So then she would have to make her way back through all the gilt chairs in order to hush them again in the hallway. And she had to work like a Trojan without really getting anywheres. And the looks of the string quartet kept getting blacker and blacker. And finally, things even got worse, because somebody discovered that the butler was laying out champagne in the library, and a regular exodus started to occur in that direction until there were only 4 people left in the salon, and they were the string quartet. So Mrs. Breen became almost frantic, and she rushed toward the library, but by the time she got there, it was jammed to the door with music lovers. Well, she finally worked her way through the crowd and told them that the champagne would not be opened until the music was over, so they might just as well make up their minds to listen to the string quartet. So she pushed them all out and locked the door, and they finally decided to go back to the salon and be quiet. But Mrs. Breen did not know that one of the guests was locked up in the library with the butler and all of that champagne. And, of course, the guest that was locked up was Dorothy. Well, it seems that the butler and Dorothy started right in to become friendly, for he was in quite a Bolshevistic state of mind himself, because by rights it should have been his night out. And it seems that he was a German butler who loved music, so he had bought himself a ticket to Lohengrin at the opera. But, of course, he had to give it up, and he could not even hear the string quartet because they had to shut the library door on account of the way the guests behaved. So he seemed to think that, in this world, it was only the wealthy who were allowed to love music. So he and Dorothy took a drink to forget their troubles. Well, the champagne was of the very best, so they had some more, and the first thing Dorothy knew, she began to cheer up and feel better. And Dorothy says that by the time the string quartet got through their program, she had reached a state where she could have been happy in a swamp. She emerged from the library and made her way back through the party, smiling to the right and left and greeting people heartily that she had not even had an introduction to. Well, when she reached the salon, it seemed that Dorothy decided to do a dance of some new step she had learned in the Follies. I mean, nobody had even asked her, but strange to say, instead of everybody being annoyed, they were all delighted, and they started to applaud. So then Dorothy decided to sing the comic version of a song that some of the girls had composed in the privacy of their own dressing room that was not even meant to be sung in the Follies, much less a salon. But instead of being shocked, those music lovers were even more delighted, and they started to crowd back into the salon in such large numbers that the string quartet that was trying its best to get out of the salon nearly had its cello smashed. Well, Dorothy became the life of the party, and Charlie Breen stood by in pride and watched her with the love light in his eyes. And Mrs. Breen finally had to step in and take Dorothy by the arm and make her stop, because she told her guests that they must not allow the dear child to overtax herself. Well, then Dorothy started to say good night to her hostess, and quite a few of the guests still crowded around to listen, because by this time Dorothy had gained quite a little reputation as a bonne mot. So Mrs. Breen was really more than sweet to Dorothy, and she took her by the hand and seemed to want to hold quite a little conversation. But Dorothy could not understand what she was saying because Mrs. Breen could not seem to help from breaking out into French. Well, Dorothy had learned quite a few Mexican words when she was in the southern part of California, so Dorothy says she came right back at her in Mexican. But Dorothy really ought not to have talked Mexican to such a refined social leader as Mrs. Breen, because hardly any society leaders know Mexican, and Dorothy was so ignorant that she did not know that it was the depths of low breeding to hold a conversation in Mexican when the one you're holding it with does not understand the Mexican language. Well, Dorothy says she finally told Mrs. Breen in Mexican to help herself to the chili, and then she took Charlie by the hand and bowed herself out. And the last she saw of Mrs. Breen, she was standing in the midst of guests who admired Dorothy, gritting her teeth and telling Charlie that he must bring his little friend again sometime. Well, when they got out, Charlie was in the seventh heaven, because it was the first time that his mother had ever approved of any Follies girl enough to ask her to come again. And everybody else was so full of enthusiasm about Dorothy that Charlie was very, very proud, so he asked her to become his bride. Well, Dorothy, as usual, was skeptical, because she had gotten an idea that Mrs. Breen's enthusiasm was forced and might break down before the altar. So she asked Charlie for time to think the proposition over. But Dorothy says that she was really intrigued by the idea of being able to return Mrs. Breen's hospitality by inviting her to their wedding breakfast. So, sometimes even a girl like Dorothy gets an impulse that is sweet. Chapter 10 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, Dorothy started to think it all over, but Charlie was really not the kind of a gentleman that appeals to a girl like she, because he spent all of his time telling her that she was wonderful and that he was nothing at all. And Dorothy prefers gentlemen who think that nothing is ideal except themselves, and let her know it. And if they accept presents from her in addition, her admiration is complete. But Charlie took the wrong way to her heart and showered her with orchids and delightful love notes, always writing something poetic like, "Oh, you wonderful girl," for instance. And then Dorothy would decide that Charlie was not so bright, or why would he think that a girl like she was wonderful? Well, about this time, Mr. Ziegfeld telegraphed to Portland, Oregon, for a band called Henderson's Jazz Band that had grown up on native soil and became famous. So this jazz band finally arrived in New York, and Mr. Buck worked them into the Follies. And in Henderson's jazz band, there was a saxophone player called Lester, who was only getting $65 a week. And as a result, he started to borrow. Well, I really feel that I do not have to write down what happened when Dorothy got in the habit of lending money to Lester, because at a time when a millionaire was clamoring for her hand, she had to fall in love with a saxophone player. And the only good reason she could think of was that the way he played the saxophone was divine, for he was the one who came out in long moans at solo parts of the blues. And I really suppose that a saxophone does make a girl feel romantic, unless she has quite a lot of willpower. Well, Dorothy finally got to bringing her costumes down in the wings and changing them with the aid of a friendly stagehand, just so that she could look at the saxophone player. And she never even thought of casting a smile at Charlie Breen, who paid $22 every night of his life to sit in the front row. But practically all that Dorothy and the saxophone player could do was to gaze at one another through the wings, because the band went right from the Follies to play at the Montmartre for the remainder of the evening. And by the time they got through at the Montmartre, they would have to go home and get some sleep so that they could get up and play at the Ritz for luncheon and tea. Well, every day Dorothy would let Charlie Breen take her to the Ritz for luncheon and tea, and every night she let him take her to the Montmartre for supper, and it really was pathetic because Charlie thought that Dorothy was reaching a point where she could stand quite a lot of him. And he never knew that it was only so that she and a saxophone player could gaze at one another. But Charlie is such a sweet boy that he hardly ever seems to notice what is going on, even when he is not drinking. And when he is drinking, he even notices less. Well, finally at the performance one night, Dorothy and the saxophone player encountered each other in the wings, and he told her that he was sick of the life of a jazz band with no one to really care. So that gave Dorothy an opening, and one thing led to another, until he invited her to marry him and spend her spare time keeping house. So Dorothy decided to ask the advice of two of her girl chums, and one of them was the captain of the Tiller girls, and the other one was Gloria, the girlfriend of Jefferson Breen. Well, Gloria warned Dorothy that it would be fatal to marry a saxophone player without giving yourself an opportunity to get sick of him first, and she told Dorothy that it was very, very unwise to pass by Charlie Breen when the worst that could happen would be alimony. But the captain of the Tiller girls was full of romance, like all girls seem to be who have not had an opportunity to meet many gentlemen, so she told Dorothy to marry the one of her choice. Well, I do not even have to write down which was the girl chum that Dorothy listened to, for she accepted the saxophone player, and they made a plan to go over to Jersey City on Sunday and get married. And Dorothy asked Charlie Breen for the loan of his car, but she failed to tell him what it was going to be used for. And she invited the captain of the Tiller girls and Mr. Henderson to go along and assist. And then, for once in her life, Dorothy really began to get a presentiment that she was doing the wrong thing, because on the way over to Jersey City, she got her first good look at Lester in the broad daylight, and Dorothy says she realized that he had found some place in New York City that could reproduce an Oregon haircut. And the nearer they got to Jersey City, the harder it was for Dorothy to figure out why she had done it. But it was too late to back out now, because she could not spoil the whole afternoon for the captain of the Tiller girls and Mr. Henderson, for they had their minds all made up to see a wedding. So Dorothy lived up to the bargain. Well, that evening Dorothy had invited guests to come to a party, and Charlie Breen had spent the whole day motoring to his father's country estate to get champagne. And after Dorothy had had quite a little champagne, she began to feel better about Lester. So she led him out of the bedroom, where he was trying to compose a telegram to break the news to the Portland Oregonian in less than 50 words, and she took him into the middle of the party and told everybody who he was. Well, Charlie Breen could have been knocked down by less than a feather, and it really was pathetic, because he did not know what to do. I mean, he could not take to drink, because he had already done that for years. So he telephoned to the Racket Club to buy him a ticket in the morning on the first ship that was going to sail to Europe. And then he said goodbye to Dorothy and wished her happiness and told the saxophone player that if he ever raised a hand to a hair of her head in any way but kindness, he would have him to deal with in the name of the law. But when Charlie staggered out of the door, Dorothy began to feel as if marrying Lester was really not such a large-size accomplishment after all. Chapter 11 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, Dorothy settled down with Lester and had an opportunity to listen to his conversation. And that was when she seemed to detect that he had started out in life as a streetcar conductor, and he had learned to play the saxophone by mail at a correspondence school to become the life of the party. But his brain still retained the ideas of a streetcar conductor, and although he constantly conversed, he really said so little that Dorothy would finally have to tell him to save his breath for his saxophone. And then words would pass between them, and finally other objects got to passing between them, like heavy iron ornaments and crockery ashtrays, for instance, and Dorothy really began to wonder if marriage was a failure. But Dorothy thought it all over, and she finally decided to try and stand him, because, after all, she had promised a Lutheran minister at New Jersey that she would, whether she liked it or not. And then Dorothy remembered that she had fallen in love with him while he was playing the saxophone, so she asked him to bring home his saxophone on Sunday, and they would have a musical afternoon, and she might fall in love with him all over again. So, on Sunday afternoon, Dorothy got up and cooked him quite a delicious breakfast, and tried to be more like a bride than usual. And after breakfast, she brought out the saxophone, and Dorothy told Lester to play her some blues, because blues always made Dorothy sentimental. But it turned out that the kind of blues that Lester played when he was all alone by himself were too depressing for human ears to hear, and that was when Dorothy learned what a conductor means to a saxophone player. Well, Dorothy finally had to ask Lester to stop, but the quarrel they had when she did was quite violent, and finally Dorothy locked herself up in the bedroom and called up the Western Union to send a cablegram to Charlie Breen and ask him the name of some lawyer, because she had decided that Lester was incompatible. So Lester heard every word, and he nearly smashed the door down, and Dorothy came out to deny his insinuations. And then he hit her with a small lamp. But Dorothy picked up an andiron in the shape of an antique Continental soldier and won the encounter. Only, instead of aiming where it would not matter, of course Dorothy had to hit Lester on the jaw and practically ruin him for playing the saxophone. So Lester went to bed and stayed there for days, while Dorothy had to support him. And once a husband gets in the habit of being supported, his usefulness is practically over. But the day after the quarrel, Dorothy received a cable from Charlie Breen, giving her the name of a lawyer named Abels and saying that he would foot all the bills for a divorce. So Dorothy went to Mr. Abels and told him her predicament. But it seems that Mr. Abels knew that Charlie was living on a small income. That was all his family would allow. And he knew that the Breen family would not be so delighted to have Dorothy get a divorce. For Mr. Abels is the kind of a lawyer that wealthy aristocratic people in New York sometimes make use of when their sons get into an affair of the heart with a girl beneath them. So he called up Mrs. Breen and asked her, and Mrs. Breen agreed and said that she would even foot the larger bills if Mr. Abels would pretend to help Dorothy get a divorce, but in reality, keep her within the bonds of matrimony at any cost. So then Mr. Abels started in to practice his profession, and he sent Charlie a cable saying, "Don't come back to America. Trying all over again with Lester. Please don't cable me. It only makes trouble. Signed, Dorothy." Well, Dorothy kept wondering why she did not hear again from Charlie, but Mr. Abels put her mind at rest by telling her that Mrs. Breen and Muriel Devenant had sailed for Europe, and Charlie had decided to stay in Paris to meet them. And to prove it, he showed Dorothy quite a cool cablegram from Charlie which said, "Please give Miss Shaw best wishes for happiness. We'll wait here for Mother and Muriel. Regards, Charles Breen. And Dorothy felt quite depressed because, after all, Charlie was the only friend she had that she could always count on, no matter what she did to him. Well, Mr. Abels told Dorothy that she could not make any real move until Lester had done something to her that was illegal in the state of New York. For the only thing a New Yorker can do illegally to his wife is to admire some girl on the outside. And as Lester had long ceased to admire Dorothy, Mr. Abels told her to leave him alone, and it would only be a matter of time. Well, Lester moved to a hotel, and all of Dorothy's girlfriends spied on him, but he seemed to do nothing but lie in bed and read, for he never went back to work. And Dorothy did not know that Mr. Abels was paying Lester quite a little money to keep his marriage vows sacred. And time went on, and still Lester did not show any signs of giving her evidence, for he only seemed to want to lie in bed with the Saturday Evening Post. But finally Mr. Abels began to have his troubles, because Lester began to wonder what good all that money was when he was watched like a hawk and was not allowed to entertain socially without a third party in the shape of a detective looking on. So he began to get nervous, and then he would have words with Mr. Abels and show his ingratitude and threaten to tell. Well, Mr. Abels knew it was not really ingratitude, but only the state of Lester's nerves, so he finally got an idea, and he sent for a nerve doctor he knew of to calm Lester down. And this nerve doctor gave Lester a diagnosis and prescribed the cocaine habit. And that calmed him down. And from that moment, Lester really began to be quite a comfort to Mr. Abels, because he developed into a regular homebody and never seemed to want to go out of his room. But one day Dorothy was coming out of the theater after the matinee with Gloria when they met a boy they knew called Claude, who used to be in the chorus, but who had practically ruined his whole career by a habit he developed of taking cocaine. Well, Claude was always standing outside the stage entrance to ask the girls for a small loan of $1, and when Dorothy saw him, she opened her pocketbook as usual. But much to her surprise, Claude said he did not need it because he said he was getting all of the stuff that he wanted for nothing, and he was bubbling over with news, for he said to Dorothy, "What do you think? I met your husband on 6th Avenue, and he's developed into a user." Well, Dorothy was dumbfounded, for cocaine is quite expensive, and if Lester was using it, Dorothy asked what was he using for money. So Claude said, "Dearie, he's scaly with it, and living in ease on the fat of the land." Well, Dorothy naturally decided that Lester must have gone to work in the cocaine profession, but Claude said, "Don't be small-minded. He's too wealthy to work, and he's giving it away." Well, then Dorothy made a remark about Lester that I can't even write down, and then Claude spoke up and said, "He may have been that before, dearie, but now he's all charm." For it seems that Claude thought Lester had become more artistic. Well, after Claude went on his way, Gloria spoke up and told Dorothy that the cocaine habit always seems to take away all a gentleman's interests in girls, and that she would probably never get the evidence. And then Dorothy began to wonder. So then she and Gloria started in to put 2 and 2 together and came to a conclusion that Mr. Abels was back of everything and was not really Dorothy's friend at heart. Well, Dorothy thought it would be quite a good idea to buy a revolver on 6th Avenue and shoot him. But Gloria had an idea that was better, because she had practically made up her mind to get Jefferson Breen to give her a trip to Paris for a vacation. So she invited Dorothy to go along and get a Paris divorce and enjoy her revenge by thinking of the idea that the Breen family money was footing the bills. Chapter 12 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, when Mr. Abels found out that Dorothy and Gloria were on a ship for Paris, he cabled Mrs. Breen. So when Mrs. Breen heard the news, she held a beautiful talk with Charlie in the Ritz bar and told him that so long as Dorothy was settled down happily in New York with her own husband, why did he not try a trip around the world in the opposite direction? And someday, when he was in the wilds of some foreign nation, he would wake up and the sun would be shining, and he would suddenly learn that he was all cured of his infatuation for Dorothy, and send a cable to Muriel Devenant, who was a girl of his own station. And it would all work out for the best, just like it does in The Student Prince. So Charlie finally agreed to go around the world with a courier who was supposed to point out things for Charlie to look at. But he really was nothing more or less than a detective in disguise. Well, then Charlie's mother felt so full of confidence that she began to get economical and cabled Mr. Abels to take Lester off the family payroll. Well, Gloria and Dorothy arrived in Paris, and they went right to the Ritz to ask for Charlie, but they learned that he was on a trip around the world with no forwarding address. Well, the only thing for them to do was to hunt up a French lawyer themselves to get Dorothy a divorce. So they found the address of one who advertised that he spoke the English language on the wall of a ladies' retiring room in a cute cabaret at Montmartre. Well, the first thing this lawyer told them was that a Paris judge would have to see Dorothy's husband personally before he could grant her a degree. So Gloria and Dorothy had to use their wits to get Lester to Paris. And the best friend they had to assist them turned out to be Claude. For it seems that Claude was the type that admires abuse, while Lester was the type that knows how to supply it. And after Lester's salary from the Breen family ceased, Claude invited Lester to move right into his room, and he really became more like a mother. But Lester would only show Claude his contempt and even throw bric-a-brac right and left, while Claude always tried to cover up the incidents that occurred. So Gloria got in correspondence with Claude, and it seems that Lester was so angry at Mr. Abels for stopping his salary that he was delighted to come to Paris and agree to a divorce. So Gloria sent Claude the money for he and Lester to get over. Well, the second thing the French lawyer told Dorothy to do was to find an apartment to be her residence in a legal way, and he sent them to a French business partner friend of his who rented apartments. Well, the apartment they found belonged to a famous French actress, and it was all furnished in the French period of decoration. I mean, wherever we Americans would have a chair, this French actress would have a couch, and wherever we would have a couch, she would have a large-size double bed. And one of them was made out of a genuine Venetian gondola with a special satin mattress and an awning, and another belonged to Madame Pompadour with 4 high bedposts that had an incense burner on the top of every one and a mirror on the ceiling. And Dorothy said that that apartment might get by as a legal residence with a French court of law, but to her mind, it was the most illegal-looking residence she had ever entered into. Well, Claude and Lester arrived in Paris and became sunk in the demi-monde as soon as they could find out where it was located. And while the French lawyer was setting the Parisian wheels of justice in motion, Gloria told Dorothy to relax and look around her and get the benefit of her travels. I mean, Gloria knows the world, for she goes abroad every year and spends all of her time in Paris. And Gloria even meets real French people, so she knows that the truth about them is that they really have very, very high ideals. I mean, we Americans always get an opinion that the French love depravity because they run such risque places for we Americans to go to in Paris. But the French never go there themselves, and they really only run risque dives for money and not for love. And millions of we Americans go to Paris every year without meeting a single French person socially, for the French are very exclusive and they never think of allowing one of we Americans in their own homes. And real French people never meet anybody except each other, and never go anywheres except to one another's homes. So Gloria told Dorothy to try and meet them and learn about the world, but Dorothy said, "What do they know about the world if they never go anywheres or meet anybody?" So Gloria became quite angry, and finally Dorothy promised to try and become more mondaine, which means a woman of the world, and even learn some of the French language. So Dorothy says the first word she learned from the French was the word Saul, which always goes before the mention of foreign names. For instance, Saul Americanes, Saul Anglaises, Saul Allemands, Saul Autriche, Saul Italians, etc. And finally, one day, Dorothy had the opportunity of meeting a genuine exclusive Frenchman. Dorothy started to walk from her apartment to the Crillon Hotel to meet Gloria for luncheon. And at the Champs-Élysées, this French gentleman with a large beard seemed to take a personal interest in her on the sidewalk. Well, Dorothy thought she must be mistaken, because Dorothy says anybody with that amount of beard ought to be thinking about things he could really accomplish. For Dorothy had not learned that the French are very, very gallant, no matter how much of a beard they cultivate. Well, Dorothy paid him little of no attention, but that did not seem to discourage him, so Dorothy stopped and told him that if he spent a whole week in a barber chair, he would still be out of her jurisdiction. But he did not understand the English language, so he kept right on. Well, Dorothy saw two French policemen holding an argument with each other on the street corner, so she went up and asked them to do something about it. But the French gentleman had stepped into a small tin retiring room on the side of the curbstone, and Dorothy could not make them understand what she was getting at. But they were very polite and wanted to help one of we Americans in distress, so one of them took out his watch and showed her the time, and the other one pointed out the direction to the American Express. And then they went back to their argument. Well, Dorothy could not do anything but go on, and sure enough, the French gentleman stepped out of his hiding place, brighter than ever, to follow. Well, Dorothy stopped once again and warned him what was going to happen, because she thought the expression she used on her face would give him a hint, even if he did not know the words. But he seemed to be the kind that likes a girl of spirit, so he kept right on. Well, when Dorothy finally reached the Crillon, she took a quick step into the entrance and decided she had escaped him at last. But as she was standing in the lobby looking for Gloria, she began to have the sensation of a beard hovering over her shoulder. So she turned around, and sure enough, there he was. Well, Dorothy lost all her endurance and gave him a slap. And to say that he was outraged would put it quite mildly. But finally all of his manhood came to his assistance, and he hit Dorothy in the jaw and knocked her down. Well, Gloria came up and got Dorothy on her feet to the retiring room in humiliation. For Gloria was very, very ashamed to think that an American girl would slap a French gentleman. It is things like that that give we Americans the reputation among the French of not having any manners. Well, after that, Dorothy says she decided to leave the French people to go around with each other, while she went around the American bar with all the other homesick Americans. And of course, the one of her choice was Eddie Goldmark of the Goldmark Film Corporation, who had just lost all his money. For it seems that he had had a great financial disappointment in his life, and the state that Dorothy was in made her an ideal listener. For it seems that Eddie Goldmark had arrived at Paris over 6 months before, full of all the enthusiasm of an American motion picture magnate who was going to open a genuine American motion picture palace at Paris with ventilation. So he had looked over all of the theaters in Paris, and finally he selected a large Parisian theater on the Grand Boulevard. And his enthusiasm was intense. So he met the Frenchman who owned the theater and bought and paid for it, and everything seemed very, very bright. But then he began to learn what happens to one of we Americans who starts out to renovate Paris. Because in the first place, the Frenchmen who sold it to him were not alone in their legal rights to that theater. I mean, every time a theater at Paris changes hands, the Frenchman that owned it the last time always sees to it that he holds on to some legal rights or other that will give him an opportunity to get into any transaction that comes up, no matter when. And by the time a Parisian theater has come down for centuries from the days of Napoleon, the number of Frenchmen who have managed to get their finger into it one way or another is really remarkable. So the Frenchmen began to pour in on Mr. Goldmark from the four quarters of Paris, and every one of them had some kind of a paper or other to sell that was legal. Well, Mr. Goldmark really began to lose some of his enthusiasm because he had to pay Frenchman after Frenchman, and they never seemed to run out. But the time finally arrived at last when no more Frenchmen seemed to appear, so Mr. Goldmark made all of his plans to begin. But that was when Mr. Goldmark learned that a Parisian theater is sacred, and you cannot put in ventilation until you have gone up before a governmental committee of architects who want to know the reason why. Because, in the old historical days of Paris, Dorothy says that people who went to the theater did not care what they smelled, and the French love to keep up all of the old traditions. So, this government committee soon let Mr. Goldmark know that we Americans cannot come over to France and do a thing like that to a historical spot like Paris. And things began to look very, very dark to Mr. Goldmark. But finally, an influential Frenchman got him off in a corner and told him that everything would be all right for 50,000 francs. Well, Mr. Goldmark's resistance had become quite low, so he gave in and paid the 50,000 francs and heaved quite a sigh to think that his troubles were over at last. But they were not really over, because that very afternoon the French ministry fell and took the influential Frenchman with Mr. Goldmark's 50,000 francs right down with it. And by the next morning, Mr. Goldmark had to face a whole new set of French government officials. Well, by this time, Mr. Goldmark's determination to accomplish what he had set out to do had become the strongest law of nature. So he clenched his teeth and faced every new French government that came up all summer long, and he paid and paid without a murmur. But anybody who knows the history of France and remembers how the French ministry went right on changing day in and day out can get an inkling of what it cost Mr. Goldmark in dollars and cents. But time went on, and the day finally arrived when Mr. Goldmark had paid so many governmental Frenchmen that it had practically reached the saturation point. And no matter how obscure any new member of any new government seemed to be, he was sure to have been paid by Mr. Goldmark at one time or another. So things were settled at last, and one morning, bright and early, Mr. Goldmark started out to renovate his theater with enough different kinds of legal papers to stop the mouth of almost anybody. Well, Mr. Goldmark reached the lobby and found his workmen awaiting him. So he gathered together a bevy of French plumbers and led them to the theater. For the first place that Mr. Goldmark had planned to attack was the old historical French lavatory. Well, when they reached it, standing in the doorway was an elderly French lavatory attendant with a determined look on her countenance and a legal paper in her hand. And it did not take Mr. Goldmark long to discover that he was being invited, in French, to enter there over her dead body. So a hurry call was sent out for lawyers and interpreters, and the whole story came out. Well, it seems that this elderly lady was called Mademoiselle Dupont, and 25 years ago she had been madly in love with a Frenchman. But as time went on, the day finally came when the Frenchman had to listen to his family and marry his fiancée. And besides, Mademoiselle Dupont had started in to show signs of age, and there was no use denying that it was high time for her to choose a new métier, French word for career. So, in order to feel that she would never be in want, the Frenchman had bought her a 25-year lease on that lavatory as a going-away present, and Mademoiselle Dupont had only worked out 15 of that 25, so she had 10 years to go, and she stood on her rights. Well, Mr. Goldmark took out his checkbook and fountain pen as usual and asked how much she wanted. But Mademoiselle Dupont said, with pride, that her métier was not for sale. Well, Mr. Goldmark thought that she was only using business methods, so he offered her more, but she refused. So then he offered her more, in francs, than all the tips she would receive for all of her natural life. But Mr. Goldmark had met his match at last, because Mademoiselle Dupont not only loved her métier, but it was a matter of sentiment, because it was all that she had to remember him by, so she refused to sell at any price. And that was when Mr. Goldmark learned that there are French people at Paris who cannot be bought and sold at every turn, and they are the real, genuine, honest French that we Americans are always hearing about, but practically never encounter. And we Americans meet millions of the other kind, and then we think that we have really met the French. Well, when Mr. Goldmark heard the final verdict of Mademoiselle Dupont, his willpower seemed to snap, for he thought it all over, and some way he could not bring himself to work up any enthusiasm in an American motion picture palace with a prehistoric Parisian lavatory. Because, in all of his dreams, he had seen 2 of them, one for the ladies and one for the gentlemen, with ventilation and water that really runs like it does in America. And he could not bring himself to see it any other way. So Mademoiselle Dupont turned out to be the straw that broke the camel's back, and Mr. Goldmark gave it all up and threw everything over, and he was only waiting around Paris until all of his publicity in America had blown over, and his magnet friends in New York had forgotten his boasts about showing the French nation what an American motion picture palace can really be. And that was how Dorothy wasted her time and opportunities in Paris listening to Mr. Goldmark and passing remarks about the French Republic until a French judge finally took a look at Lester and granted her a degree. So Dorothy sailed back home, free at last, to God's country. Chapter 13 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, Dorothy's husband finally became a drifter, and he and Claude drifted back to New York and began to follow the line of least restraints. And Dorothy says the least restraints they were able to find was in a nest of interior decorators on West 45th Street. Well, Lester spent all of his spare time trying to get an interview with Mr. Abels to find out why the Breen family had withdrawn their support when he could tell so much that would be illegal evidence against them. Well, Mr. Abels was much too prominent to waste his time with anyone like Lester, but Lester and his boyfriends were talking so much against the Breen family in public places that he finally made an appointment to let Lester come to his office and hear him out. Well, Claude begged and begged to be allowed to accompany Lester, because after all, Mr. Abels was very, very full of power, and Claude was an inveterate lion hunter at heart. So Lester gave in at last and let Claude go along. And when they went into Mr. Abel's polished suite of mahogany offices, Claude's manners were full of reverence, for Claude believed that using the gentle tactics would get them farther in the long run. So, as soon as they were shown to a seat, Claude spoke up and said, "Mr. Abels, we're thrilled to be here. Lester and I often sit at home in the long evenings and read one of your famous speeches, just to improve our minds." So then Lester spoke up in quite a harsh tone and said, "You poor sap! When did we ever sit at home and read anything?" Well, Claude was visibly upset and said, "Now don't be low. What kind of swine is Mr. Abels going to think we are?" Well, then they started to give and take, and it really developed into quite a little quarrel. But Mr. Abels soon got enough of that kind of conversation, so he spoke up and told Lester to get down to brass tacks. But Claude spoke up again and said, "Justice to all is what we are after." So then Lester said, "Will you shut up?" For it turned out that what Lester was after was $10,000, or he would tell everything to the lower type of pictorial news sheets. Well, Mr. Abels asked for time to consult his clients, and when he consulted the Breen family, they really went into a panic, for they had been representative Americans from the days of the Revolution, and nothing they had ever done had ever leaked out before. But Mr. Abels told them that he could keep the old Breen family name from being smirched if they would just give him a blank card to do what he wished, no matter how much it might cost them. I mean, provided they did not mind what happened to Dorothy's husband. Well, they were really at the end of their wits, so they finally told him to go ahead. And then Mr. Abels sent out for the aid of a silent business partner of his, called Jerry, who was the leader of the whole Brooklyn demi-monde. I mean, this Jerry had a gang of gangsters that pretended to be bootleggers to get by the law, but they really specialized in work of a more violent nature, such as murder, for instance. And about 2 nights later, Jerry picked up an acquaintance with Lester and Claude in a public place and took them to attend a party on the top floor of quite a high apartment house in Brooklyn. Well, Jerry's gang was full of ex-icemen of the strong male type, who had been driven from their livelihood by frigid air, and those ex-icemen could not seem to bear Claude, and they thought that Lester was so much better by comparison that they said they thought he ought to be the one allowed to live if there was any preference. But Jerry said to them, "What the hell? Who's giving this party?" Well, they had to admit that it was Jerry, so Jerry said, "Then we'll stick to our etiquette and bump off the right guy." And before the evening was over, Lester got quite a lot more obnoxious, so they were all more content with the arrangements. And about 5 o'clock in the morning, when everybody was in the heights of good spirits, Jerry went into a little alcove to look out the window. And then he called to Lester and said, "Come on in here, pal, and look at the swell sunrise." Well, Lester went into the alcove to look, but his foot must have slipped because he fell out the window, and the verdict was suicide. Well, the funeral of Dorothy's husband was quite a novelty in the way of a funeral, for Claude borrowed a beautiful apartment of their modern art interior decorator friend to hold it in, and it seems that Claude had his own philosophy, which was really more New Thought than anything, and it was really very, very beautiful. Well, the funeral was a stag affair, and Claude gathered together quite a few acquaintances and a bevy of chorus boys for the vocal members. And Claude had searched high and low for a very, very beautiful vase of the Grecian period to put the ashes in, with Greek silhouettes of dancers doing an antique dance in the nude all around it. And it seems that they were going to put the ashes in it with a beautiful ceremony Claude had thought up that would be full of rhythms. But first of all, Claude held a beautiful talk and said that, in his philosophy, it was nothing but a beautiful journey. And Claude said he knew that Lester would want them to look at it in that way, and they must hold everything just as he would wish it. So they did not break down, but they all bore up, and then Claude brought out a bottle of very, very rare old wine and said that they were all to drink in the spirit of sacrifice. Well, they all drank it, and then they were all to sing, not the kind of hymns that are uncheerful, but "It's a Long, Long Lane," which was one of his favorites. Well, they all sang in harmony, and then they were all to drink one more glass of sacrificial wine. But there was not enough sacrificial wine to go around, and they put it in a bowl and added some gin they had, and they all had another drink in the spirit of sacrifice. Well, then Claude started to give them another talk about his philosophy, but while he was giving it, an art dancer called Osmer came in with a bottle of absinthe, so they decided to put that in the bowl and try it. And after they tried it, Claude wanted to go on with his talk. But by this time, some of the other guests seemed to get the feeling that Claude was flaunting his philosophy, as if he was the only guest at the whole funeral who had any. And it made them quite annoyed, so they all started in to tell their philosophy. But it turned out to be quite confusing, because some of them were New Thought and some of them were occultism, while others were Om, the Omnipotent, and they did not seem to be getting anywheres. Well, Claude finally disappeared for a moment, and when he came back, he was dressed in the robes of a beautiful old antique Grecian dancer with bare feet and a band around his head, to proceed with the ceremony of putting the ashes in the beautiful vase that was worthy of such a contents. So he tried to call everybody to order, but by that time they had all gotten interested in other things, and finally Claude became quite ironical and said, "If you boys don't object, we'll go on with the obsequies." Well, it seems that they were all still annoyed with Claude for trying to flaunt himself, and finally one of the guests who had already shown signs of becoming obnoxious took a large drink for courage and spoke up and said, "You make me sick." Well, there was quite a lull at such a lack of reverence. But finally Claude found his tongue and spoke up and said, "What do you mean I make you sick?" Well, then this guest took another large drink and started in to tell what he really thought about the deceased in no plain terms. Well, everybody was dumbfounded except Osmer, because it seems that Osmer had been looking for just such an opening all evening, so he went over to the opposition and said, "You are right, he was a low thing to be despised by all." Well, it was quite a few moments before Claude could believe his own ears, but when he finally found his tongue, he spoke up and said, "I resent this." So then quite a few resented it, and it really began to look like trouble. Well, then the instigator of the whole thing spoke up in quite a pointed way and asked, "How about that time he hit you with a hairbrush?" So then Claude spoke up and said, "It was not a hairbrush. It was a mirror, and it broke. Worse luck." "And now," spoke up the instigator, "you have got to have 7 years of misfortune." Well, Claude really had to admit that it was no gesture to make with a mirror at a person who was superstitious in the first place. And then Osmer broke in and said, "Yes, how about the time you had to lock him out to keep from bodily harm, and he stuffed straw under the door and lit it?" Well, at that, one of the others spoke up and added fuel and said, "Yes, and the time he stood in Child's restaurant and called you vile names for all the world to hear." Well, Claude finally had to admit the contention, and one unpleasant reminiscence led to another until they were all thoroughly fed up with the subject, and they did not even want any mementos around the apartment that would remind them of any such a person. So they started in to hunt for mementos, but while they were scurrying here and there and everywhere, Claude stubbed his bare toe on the can full of ashes. Well, that was really the last straw, for Claude's nerves had reached the snapping point. So he screamed, "A wench's curse on such as he!" And he grabbed the can full of ashes and threw them down the sink, and the funeral dispersed. Chapter 14 of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda. Well, Charlie Breen's trip around the world turned out to be quite an education, because that was where he acquired all the knowledge he has learned about sake and mezcal and vodka and okwape. But finally, the drinks of all the nations began to tell on him in a hospital at Shanghai. Even in the midst of delirium treatments at China, where other patients would be seeing peculiar animals, Charlie always seemed to be seeing Dorothy, and the courier had only bad news to cable Charlie's mother. But finally, Charlie and his courier arrived at San Francisco at last, and Mrs. Breen went out to California to meet them, hoping against hope that Charlie was cured. I mean, she did not mind the delirium treatments so much, but what she really meant was Dorothy, because after all, she was a mother with a mother's love, and if her only son married the girl of his choice, he might get left out of the social register. Well, when Mrs. Breen heard the truth from the courier, she reached the depths of despondency, for Dorothy was back in New York and free to marry anyone. So that night, she sat up late in her suite at the St. Francis Hotel and got Mr. Abels in New York on the telephone and told him to do something definite to Dorothy before Charlie arrived at New York. Well, Mr. Abels called in another one of his silent legal assistants who was more versed in the rougher kind of law and put the case into his hands. So this assistant thought the best thing to do would be to have someone put some kind of illegal dope in Dorothy's handbag and have the police arrest Dorothy for being in its possession. And that would prove to Charlie Breen what kind of a girl he had picked out to be the mother of his children. So an assistant lady detective put it in Dorothy's handbag in the ladies' room at the Club Dover, and it all worked out just as they had planned. Well, the police took Dorothy to the station, where she had to mingle with common girls of the sidewalks, and the girl next to Dorothy was colored. Well, her name was Lulu, and she seemed to want to be quite friendly, so she said to Dorothy, "Hello, honey." So Dorothy said, "Hello." And then Lulu said, "What they get you for?" Well, Dorothy was trying to fight back the tears, but she wanted to be polite, and she did not like to tell Lulu that she was innocent, because Lulu looked quite guilty. So Dorothy said, "Same thing as you, I guess." So Lulu spoke up and said, "Then I 'spect they pick you up for soliciting." So then Lulu became quite thoughtful, and after she had thought quite a while, she said to Dorothy, "What they tryin' to do? Stop that thing?" I mean, Lulu seemed to think that the police had undertaken quite a large job. Well, I have always said, in play, that someday Dorothy would end up in a jail, but when she finally did, I could hardly believe my ears. I mean, it is really quite a shock for a society matron who is a mother to be paged at 4 o'clock in the morning at the Club Lido and told that her best friend is in the station. So Henry and I went right over to see her, but by the time we arrived, there was hardly a policeman in the whole station whose heart was in his work. Because Dorothy is the kind of a girl who was always popular with the police, and every other criminal in the whole station was being grossly neglected for Dorothy. Well, they brought Dorothy into a small private office for us to see, and the tears were streaming down her face, but at the same time she was trying to be brave, with the smiles coming through in a way that was practically irresistible to the authorities. And I will never, never forget how Dorothy looked up at me through her tears and said, "Well, Lorelei, I suppose we couldn't expect to keep out of here forever." Well, the first thing Henry did was to send for Mr. Dudley Field Malone, who is one of the most famous lawyers on the side of the oppressed. So he came down to the station, and when he heard Dorothy's troubles, his blood boiled over, for he loves nothing better than prosecuting the wealthy kind of people who think that they can make up their own laws as they go along. And after he got through putting two and two together, he figured out that the Breen family had done enough to Dorothy to put them all in jail for 190 years without clemency. So Mr. Malone went to the Breen family, and when he got through with them, they not only released Dorothy from jail, but they settled a sum of $500 a month damages on her for the rest of her natural life. Well, the very next day, Charlie arrived home from his travels, and the meeting that took place between Charlie Breen and Dorothy was one of the most pathetic things that has ever occurred in the Colony restaurant. For while Henry and Dorothy and I were sitting there eating delicious soup, we happened to look up, and there was Charlie Breen, and it was really quite a shock to see what foreign travels and oriental drinks, far from the girl of his choice, had done to his personal appearance. Well, he came over to the table shaking quite a lot, and he was so upset at seeing Dorothy at last that he practically broke down. And it always makes me feel so sentimental to watch a gentleman break down that I almost believe my eyes became moist. But all Dorothy said was, "Hello, Charlie. You look awful." For Dorothy has never learned how to be complimentary. Well, Charlie sat down and we all had dinner. And when he heard the case that his family had trumpeted up against Dorothy, he became quite an ungrateful son. For the very next day he called the whole Breen family together and told them quite a few plain truths and got himself disinherited. Well, then Charlie had to go to Dorothy and tell her that he did not have a penny in the world. And for the first time in Charlie's whole career, he began to intrigue her interest. So I had quite a little talk with Charlie and told him to go even further and ask Dorothy to lend him some money. So he borrowed $500 from Dorothy to get a new start in life, selling automobiles, and Dorothy began to sit up and take notice. Well, it turned out that going to work seemed to make Charlie decide to stop drinking, and when he stopped drinking, he stopped feeling so humble, because then he did not have anything to apologize for. And, on the contrary, he started in to become quite a bore, telling everybody else about the vileness of the bad habit of drinking in comparison with he, himself, who never touched it. And when Charlie began to give himself recommendations, he really gave Dorothy quite a little thrill. But what really capped the climax was that instead of always saying something complimentary to Dorothy like, "Oh, you wonderful girl," for instance, Charlie took to looking Dorothy over in his sober senses and seeing her as she really was and making remarks like, "Go wash your face. You've got on too much makeup." And Dorothy fell in love. Well, I told Dorothy that, under the circumstances, the ceremony ought to be in some justice of the peace's back office, where the absence of the bridegroom's family could be overlooked by gossip. But, strange to say, Dorothy began to get very, very refined and full of etiquette, and wanted to have a large-size social ceremony in a church. And it finally came out that she had wired for her father to come clear from Modesto and give her away for the event. Well, I told Dorothy that she was taking a very great risk to have a father give away a bride whose only public training in etiquette had been jumping off roofs at street fairs. And I began to become quite worried. But nothing could stop Dorothy, and she went right on and ordered steel-engraved invitations from Cartier's and sent them out to not only everybody in the social register, but to all her personal girlfriends in the Follies besides. Well, all of Dorothy's friends accepted, and so did all of the younger society set of the social register, but the older set all refused. I mean, with one exception, and that was old Lady Vandervent, who always looked on the bright side. And she had not learned what kind of a girl Charlie was marrying, because she only reads the Christian Science Monitor and does not know all the evil that is going on in the world. Well, the day before the ceremony, Dorothy and I went down to the Grand Central Station to meet Dorothy's father. And he got off of the trains with 4 valises that it took 2 red caps apiece to lift off the sidewalk on account of the heavy Pacific gravity of the liquor that was practically all they contained. And it seems he had made it with his own hands, and the reason he brought it to New York was not so much that he cared whose liquor he drank, as it was personal pride in his own achievement. But I told Dorothy that that was the kind of an achievement that adds very little to a large religious ceremony in a church. But the way it turned out, sending for Mr. Shaw was really quite a happy thought, because he had had quite a lot of experience handing girls down off of platforms. So when he gave Dorothy away, he did it with the most graceful gesture that I have ever seen inside of a church. Well, after the ceremony came the wedding reception at my salon, and I really must pay quite a few compliments to the way a few of us behaved. I mean, all of the girls from the Follies were overcome by the sanctity of the occasion, and even Mr. Shaw, who drank quite a lot, only became more and more gallant. But I cannot say so much for the society set. I mean, I tried quite hard to lead them a good example by refusing champagne, but they started in to drink so heavily that finally Mrs. Vandervent came to me and said that she could not remain any longer without seeming to give them her personal sanction. But she apologized very much for the way her social-born friends were acting, and she said that it was girls like Dorothy and I who could be impressed by such an occasion that would have to carry on the fabric of society. And then she said that she wanted nobody but that delightful Mr. Shaw to be her escort home. Well, I told Dorothy to give her father some kind of a warning against all of his gallantry, so Dorothy got him off in one corner and said, "Pop, if you make a pass at old Lady Vandervent on the way home, you must take the first train out of New York society in the morning." But the next day, Mrs. Vandervent's footman told my chauffeur, and he told my maid, that Dorothy's father did make a pass at Mrs. Vandervent in the cabriolet, but she enjoyed it. So everything turned out for the best after all, and the last I saw of Dorothy, Charlie was ordering her around on the train to Atlantic City in his sober state, and Dorothy was more refined than I have ever seen her before, with even a trace of dignity. And it has turned out that the old Lady Vandervent and I have become almost inseparable because we have practically the same ideals about everything. So I really believe that I shall be the next one to get into the social register, because the way they are having to put society people out of it, somebody or other has got to take their place, and it will probably be me. And when I get in, I'm going to try to get Dorothy in too, because we have been in almost everything else together. And if I do manage to get Dorothy into the social register, I shall really have to begin to believe that the world is quite a good place to live in, even in the case of a girl like Dorothy. The end. End of But Gentlemen Marry Brunettes by Anita Loos. Read by Jenn Broda.